Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The war had dragged on for decades, and humanity was beginning to lose its grip. Every new alien technology, every advance in military strategy by the Shadows pushed Earth closer to the brink. It was clear, to survive, humanity would have to evolve. The Spider Gene Project was born from that desperation. Xander Kane stood at the edge of a cliff, looking out over the vast, charred battlefield below. He and his squad of spider walkers had been dropped into this hostile terrain to take out one of the Shadow's forward bases. Their bodies, enhanced with spider DNA, gave them an advantage, an unnatural advantage. They could scale walls like the creatures they'd been fused with, cling to ceilings, weave webs strong enough to trap their enemies. It was supposed to be the key to turning the tide of war. But something gnawed at Xander. Behind the success of their missions, a shadow of doubt had begun to cloud his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this project than they had been told, and the mission they had just completed, the way the alien technology had reacted to them, as if they were part of it, left him unsettled. "Commander, you ready to head back?" Sergeant Jax's voice broke Xander from his thoughts. He turned to his second in command, a man he'd fought alongside for years. Jax was tough, reliable, and steady, as someone who didn't ask too many questions. Maybe that was why Xander felt a pang of hesitation as he replied. "Yeah, let's get back to the ship," Xander said, forcing a smile. "We've got a debrief to attend." The team gathered their gear and moved swiftly to the extraction point, their movements almost inhuman as they navigated the rugged terrain with ease, their spider-enhanced abilities making it seem effortless. The ride back to the human base was silent. The squad had grown used to the quiet after missions. For all their success, there was a lingering sense of discomfort that none of them dared voice. The Spider Gene Project had made them weapons, not people. The debriefing was short, as expected. High Command praised them for another successful mission, but Xander barely listened. His mind was elsewhere, still replaying the strange feeling he'd had inside the alien facility. After the meeting, Xander took the long way back to his quarters, stopping by the research wing of the base. The sterile corridors hummed with activity, but Xander's destination was a small office near the back, where the architect of the Spider Gene Project, Dr. Marcellus Grange, worked. Grange was hunched over his desk when Xander entered, his fingers tapping rapidly on a glowing console. The doctor didn't look up. "Commander Kane," he said without turning around, "I assume you've come with questions." Xander narrowed his eyes. "How did you know?" Grange finally looked up, his face gaunt and his eyes dull from years of sleepless work. "You're not the first of your kind to come here after a mission. What is it this time? The itching under your skin? The strange dreams?" "No," Xander said, stepping closer. "It's about the mission. When we were inside the alien base, the technology there, it reacted to us, almost like it knew we were there, like it recognized us." Grange's face darkened, but he didn't speak. "I want answers, Grange," Xander pressed. "What's really going on with this gene modification? Why are we so important to them?" The doctor stood slowly, walking to a window that looked out over the base. He sighed, his breath fogging the glass. "The Spider Gene Project was never about making humans stronger, Xander. It was about making humans compatible." "Compatible with what?" "With them," Grange said, turning to face him. "With the Shadows. You're not just soldiers. You're being turned into something more, into something that they can control." Xander felt the floor drop out from under him. "What the hell are you talking about?" "The gene modifications were never fully human in origin," Grange explained. "They were designed based on alien extracted from a species the Shadows once controlled. They're turning you into hybrids, into tools that they can use to integrate humans into their empire." Xander's mind raced. Why? Why would the military go along with this? "Because they think it's the only way to win the war," Grange said bitterly. "By becoming part of the enemy." Xander's chest tightened, anger boiling under his skin. "And you're just going along with this?" "I didn't have a choice," Grange said, his voice quiet. But you do. Xander left the research wing in a daze, Grange's words echoing in his head. He couldn't believe it. His entire squad, his entire species was being manipulated, twisted into something monstrous. The thought of it made his skin crawl. Back in his quarters, Xander paced the floor, trying to process what he'd learned. The war had already cost humanity so much, and now it seemed like they were about to lose their very identity. He had to do something. He couldn't let this happen, but he knew he couldn't do it alone. The next day, Xander called a meeting with his squad. They gathered in a secluded part of the base, away from prying eyes. The atmosphere was tense, with an unspoken understanding that something serious was about to go down. "I need to tell you all something," Xander began, his voice steady but grave. "This gene modification, it's not what we thought. It's not about making us stronger. It's about turning us into something inhuman." The squad exchanged glances, confusion and disbelief spreading across their faces. "What the hell are you talking about, Commander?" Jax asked, his voice skeptical. Xander explained everything he'd learned from Grangia, the alien DNA, the Shadow's plan, the military's complicity. By the time he finished, the room was thick with tension. "Bullshit," one of the soldiers muttered, shaking his head. "This is some kind of mind game. You've been in the field too long, Commander." But Xander could see the seeds of doubt beginning to take root in some of them. They'd all felt the strange pull of the alien technology, the way their bodies responded to it. They couldn't deny that something was off. Jax looked conflicted. He had always been loyal to Xander, but this was a lot to take in. "If what you're saying is true, then what the hell do we do?" "We fight," Xander said firmly. "We expose this. We take down the whole damn operation. If we don't, we're all going to end up as tools for those things out there." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, slowly, one by one, the soldiers nodded. They had followed Xander through hell and back. They would follow him again. The next few days were spent in secret preparation. Xander and his squad began gathering intel, making contacts, and planning their next move. It wasn't easy, and everywhere they turned, they were met with walls of secrecy and misinformation. But Xander was determined. He wasn't just fighting for his team, he was fighting for all of humanity. As the day of their first strike approached, tension mounted. They had identified a key facility involved in the Spider Gene Project, a remote research station where hybridization experiments were being conducted. Their plan was to infiltrate the base, destroy the research, and broadcast the truth to the rest of the military. The night of the mission, Xander's heart raced as he and his team suited up. They moved with the silent precision of predators, their spider-like abilities making them almost invisible as they scaled the walls of the facility and slipped inside undetected. But as they reached the heart of the base, things went wrong. They found the research chamber, but it was heavily guarded by alien-human hybrids, creatures that looked like twisted versions of themselves, their bodies warped and fused with alien technology. The sight of them was enough to turn Xander's stomach. "We've got company," Jax whispered, his voice tight. Xander signaled for silence, his mind racing as he assessed the situation. They were outnumbered, and the hybrids were stronger than anything they'd faced before. But they couldn't turn back now. Xander signaled for his squad to take defensive positions. They had trained for Thesa's stealth, precision, the art of moving unnoticed. But nothing could have prepared them for the twisted figures before them. The alien-human hybrid stood taller than any of them, their skin slick and dark, and their limbs extended in unnatural ways, reinforced with alien technology. They moved like predators, their heads turning unnervingly in unison as if sensing the intruders in their midst. "We can't take them head on," Xander muttered under his breath, his eyes scanning for any weak points. They were outnumbered and in enemy territory, but they still had their stealth abilities. With a silent hand signal, he ordered his team to split. Half would draw the hybrid's attention while the others would infiltrate deeper into the research facility to gather proof of the horrors taking place here. Jax nodded from across the room, his face tight with concentration. Even with the tension between them, Jax knew this was the only way. As Xander and his team crept along the edges of the chamber, the hybrids began to move, their large, insect-like limbs clicking against the metallic floor. Xander's breath caught in his throat. If they were discovered now, it would be over. But his squad, moving like shadows, managed to slip through the defenses. The air was thick with tension, every creak of their suits amplified in Xander's mind. Suddenly, one of the hybrids turned sharply, its black eyes locking on to the point where Jax and his half of the team were positioned. Xander's heart jumped as the creature let out a low, guttural sound, a sound that reverberated through the chamber and alerted the others. "Now!" Xander shouted, breaking the silence. The squad sprang into action. Jax and his team began firing, aiming for the hybrids' heads. Xander launched himself forward, using his enhanced abilities to propel himself up the walls, firing down on the hybrids as he leapt from one point to another. The air was filled with the crack of gunfire and the screeches of the hybrids, but the creatures were relentless, closing in fast. Xander weaved through the chaos, his focus locked on getting to the central research hub. His team was holding their own, but barely. The hybrids were stronger and faster than anything they'd faced before, and their alien enhancements made them nearly impossible to bring down. Suddenly, one of the hybrids lunged toward Jax, its elongated arms sweeping through the air. Jax dodged just in time, but it was clear they couldn't keep this up for long. Xander's mind raced. If they didn't act quickly, they would all be dead. As he reached the far side of the chamber, Xander spotted the control terminal. This was Ida, the nerve center of the research facility. If he could hack into the system, he could download the files they needed and destroy the facility from within. "Cover me!" Xander shouted, sprinting toward the terminal. The team responded instantly, laying down heavy fire to keep the hybrids at bay. Xander's fingers flew across the control panel, inputting codes and bypassing the security measures. His heart pounded in his chest, every second stretching into an eternity. A loud crash behind him made him spin around. One of the hybrids had broken through the defensive line and was bearing down on Jax, who had fallen to one knee, blood streaming from a gash in his side. Without thinking, Xander fired his grappling web at the hybrid, yanking it off balance and sending it crashing to the floor. Jax gave him a tight nod, his face pale but determined. Xander turned back to the terminal, the download nearing completion. They were almost there, but the hybrids were closing in, their screeches echoing off the walls. Xander's mind was racing. There was no way they could hold out much longer. Finally, the download finished. Xander ripped the data drive from the terminal and slammed his fist on the self-destruct button. Alarms blared throughout the facility, red lights flashing as the countdown began. "Move, now!" Xander shouted. The squad bolted for the exit, their bodies moving with the speed and agility granted by the spider gene. But the hybrids weren't finished. They lunged after them, their long arms reaching out, claws scraping against the walls as the team raced toward the transport ship. Jax stumbled, his injury slowing him down. Xander grabbed him, hauling him forward. "Come on, we're not leaving anyone behind." The team made it to the extraction point just as the first explosions rocked the facility. Fire and smoke erupted behind them, but they kept running. The hybrid shrieks were drowned out by the deafening roar of destruction as the facility collapsed in on itself. They leapt into the transport ship, the door slamming shut as it lifted off into the sky. Xander collapsed into a seat, his chest heaving as he looked around at his squad. They were alive, but barely. Jax was bleeding heavily, and several others had taken hits from the hybrids. But they had done it. They had the proof. And now, the real fight would begin. The transport ship hummed as it shot through the atmosphere, headed back toward the safety of their base. Xander sat in silence, staring at the data drive in his hand. This was the key to everything, the key to exposing the truth about the Spider Gene Project, about the military's betrayal, about the hybridization program. But even as relief washed over him, Doubt crept into his mind. Would it be enough? Would the people in power actually care? Or had they already fallen too deep into the shadow's influence? Jax groaned from across the cabin, pulling Xander's attention. His friend's face was pale, his breathing shallow. Xander moved quickly, grabbing a medkit and kneeling beside him. "Hold on, Jax," he muttered, applying pressure to the wound. "We're almost there." Jax opened his eyes, the usual fire in them dimmed by pain. "We did it, huh?" "Yeah," Xander said, though the words felt hollow. "We did it." Jax grunted in response, his head falling back against the seat. Xander finished bandaging the wound, his mind spinning with the weight of what they had just accomplished. He wanted to believe that this was a victory, that they had struck a blow against the conspiracy threatening to destroy them. But he knew this was just the beginning. When they reached the base, Xander and the team were immediately rushed into a debriefing. High Command, however, was not pleased with their actions. The destruction of a key research facility without authorization was a breach of protocol, and despite the evidence they presented, the brass seemed more concerned with the loss of valuable assets than the truth behind the spider gene project. Xander's frustration boiled over. "You don't get it. They're turning us into hybrids. They're using us as tools for the shadows." The commanding officer, General Ilya Varkov, stared at him coldly. "What I see, Commander Kane, is a soldier who has disobeyed direct orders and jeopardized a critical project for humanity's survival." Xander clenched his fists. "Survival at what cost?" Varkov's expression remained stony. "You're dismissed, Commander." As Xander and his team left the debriefing room, the weight of the general's words hung heavy over them. It was clear now, they were on their own. The military wasn't going to stop the spider gene project. If anything, they were going to double down. Xander knew what had to be done. In the days that followed, Xander and his remaining loyal squad members went underground. They operated in the shadows, gathering allies and preparing for the final strike. Their mission was clear: dismantle the spider gene project and expose the truth to the rest of humanity. It wasn't easy. The military had branded them as traitors, and they were being hunted. But Xander's team had one advantage: like their namesakes, they had become masters of hiding, of moving unseen, and they had the proof they needed. The final confrontation came at the heart of the Spider Gene Project's operations, a massive underground facility where hybrid soldiers were being bred in secret. Xander led the assault, his team slipping through the defenses with ease, taking out guards and scientists as they made their way deeper into the complex. But as they reached the central chamber, they found themselves face to face with General Varkov. The man stood tall, his eyes cold and calculating. "You've come this far, Kane," Varkov said, his voice dripping with disdain. "But it's too late. The hybrid program is humanity's future. You can't stop it." Xander raised his weapon, his voice steady. "You're wrong. Humanity doesn't need to become monsters to survive." Varkov smirked. "You'll never understand. This is evolution. This is how we win." Before Xander could respond, the hybrids attacked. The room erupted into chaos as the creatures lunged at them, their bodies blending seamlessly with the alien technology that lined the walls. Xander and his team fought with everything they had, their enhanced abilities pushing them to the limit. But even as they fought, Xander knew what had to be done. He made his way to the control panel, overriding the system and initiating the self-destruct sequence. The facility began to shake, alarms blaring as the countdown ticked away. Xander's heart pounded as he fired off one last shot, taking down the final hybrid before turning to his team. "Let's go!" he shouted, and they ran. The explosions began as they reached the surface, fire and smoke engulfing the facility behind them. Xander didn't look back. They had done it. They had destroyed the heart of the hybrid program. As they disappeared into the night, Xander knew the fight was far from over. But for the first time, there was hope. Humanity's future would be written by those who refused to become the tools of their enemies. And Xander would be there to lead them. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The world had fallen into silence after the Great Catastrophe. Cities once brimming with life were now nothing but skeletal remains, broken and empty, their structures draped in thick webs spun by the invaders who ruled over it all. In this wasteland of crumbled towers and twisted metal, Ethan moved carefully, his steps slow and deliberate, eyes constantly scanning the ruins. One wrong move, one sound too loud, and the spiders would come. The spiders were everywhere, massive creatures with bulbous eyes, spindly legs, and webs as thick as steel cables. They had overrun the planet, their domination absolute. The few humans that remained had been forced into hiding, living in the forgotten crevices of the world, underground tunnels, derelict subway stations, and the basements of old, decaying buildings. Ethan was no different. Only 17, but he had been forced to grow up quickly, survival sharpening his instincts to a razor's edge. His home was a small, hidden bunker, buried beneath the rubble of what used to be a shopping mall. He and a small group of survivors lived there, scraping by with whatever food they could scavenge, their existence marked by constant fear and fleeting hope. Every day, the sound of the spiders clicking their mandibles echoed through the city, a reminder that humanity's reign had ended. Today was no different. Ethan had ventured out, as he did every few days, looking for supplies. He crept through the wreckage of an old electronics store, overturned shelves and shattered glass underfoot, his breath steady but shallow. He knew the routine well. Stay low, stay quiet, avoid the webs. But as he sifted through the debris, something caught his eye, a soft, faint glow coming from the back of the store. Curiosity got the better of him. Moving cautiously, he picked his way through the fallen shelves and debris, his heart pounding in his chest. The glow grew brighter as he approached, illuminating a small alcove hidden behind a collapsed wall. There, nestled in a pile of dust-covered equipment, was the source of the light, a strange, pulsating object, unlike anything he had ever seen. It was spherical, no larger than a baseball, but it hummed with energy, its surface smooth and black, veined with tiny strands of glowing light. Ethan crouched down, staring at it in awe. What was it? Some kind of old tech? A relic from before the invasion? Whatever it was clearly important, and perhaps, valuable. His fingers hovered over it for a moment, hesitation creeping in. But before he could pull back, there was a sharp crack. The orb splintered open, releasing a blinding flash of light. Ethan gasped as a wave of energy surged through him, knocking him backward. The world spun, and for a few heartbeats, everything went black. When he came to, his body felt strange. His vision was sharper, his hearing more acute. The faint sounds of such distant creaks of rusting metal, the skittering of small animals came into focus as if they were right next to him. But more than that, there was something else, a new sensation. He raised his hand, and to his shock, thin threads of webbing shot from his fingertips, latching onto the wall beside him. What the? He tried to pull his hand back, but the threads held fast. Panic surged through him, but after a moment of struggling, he relaxed, focusing on the sensation. Slowly, carefully, he willed the threads to release. To his amazement, they responded, retracting into his fingers as if they had never been there. His heart raced. Somehow, in that flash of energy, the object had given him a power to control the very thing the spiders used to dominate the planet. He could manipulate the threads, just like they did. But the realization brought with it a new fear. If he had this power, would the spiders sense it? Were they coming for him now? He couldn't wait to find out. Ethan scrambled to his feet, grabbed what few supplies he had found, and hurried back toward the bunker. He moved faster than usual, his mind racing with the possibilities and the dangers of what had just happened. The bunker was buried deep under the remains of an old subway station. Hidden from the surface, it was a safe haven for Ethan and the other survivors. As he slipped inside, the familiar, musty scent of damp concrete and old machinery greeted him. The group was small, just a handful of survivors who had banded together in the face of extinction. There was Dr. Calder, a former scientist with a wiry frame and sharp eyes, who had taken charge after the invasion. Mara, a former soldier who had more scars than anyone else in the group, and a few others of people who had lost everything and were just trying to survive. As Ethan entered, Dr. Calder glanced up from a makeshift table where he was tinkering with an old radio, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Anything out there?" Calder asked, his voice tired but hopeful. "Just the usual," Ethan replied, setting his pack down. "With a broken bar I found something." He wasn't sure how to explain it, but as he began to tell them about the glowing object and the surge of energy, their skepticism was evident. Mara crossed her arms, her expression hard. "You're telling me you can control webs now, like the spiders?" Ethan nodded, raising his hand. A single thread shot from his fingertips, weaving through the air like a snake before retracting back. The room fell silent. Dr. Calder's eyes widened. "That's a broken bar impossible." "Looks pretty possible to me," Mara muttered, still eyeing Ethan with suspicion. Calder stepped closer, examining Ethan with a mix of fascination and disbelief. "This could change everything. If you can control the threads, maybe broken bar, maybe we can fight back." For the first time in months, the spark of hope flickered in Calder's eyes. But it was a fragile thing, easily snuffed out by the harsh reality of their situation. "We've tried fighting back before," Mara said, her voice bitter. "It didn't end well." "Maybe this time will be different," Ethan said quietly. "Maybe we can actually win." The following days were a blur of training and experimentation. Ethan worked with Calder, honing his newfound abilities, learning to manipulate the webs with precision and control. He could weave them into ropes, shields, even crude weapons. The more he practiced, the more confident he became. The others watched in awe, their skepticism slowly giving way to hope. Word of Ethan's powers spread among the survivors, and soon, more people came to the bunker, drawn by the possibility of rebellion. Small groups formed, training under Ethan's guidance, learning to fight back using the very tools of their enemy. They struck at the spiders with a new ferocity, setting traps, sabotaging their webs, and destroying the drones that patrolled the city. But the spiders were not mindless. They had a queen, a massive, terrifying creature named Nyxia, who ruled over the web with cold, calculated intelligence. She sensed the shift in the tide of battle and directed her drones to hunt down the rebels. Ethan knew they were running out of time. Nyxia would not rest until they were all dead. "We need to hit them where it hurts," Calder said one evening as they huddled around a flickering lantern. "Their central web fortress. It's the heart of their operations. If we can take it out, we might have a chance." Ethan's mind raced as he considered Dr. Calder's words. The central web fortress. It was the heart of the spider's empire, the place where Nyxia controlled her vast network of drones and soldiers. To take it down would be a suicide mission, yet it was their only chance. The small underground bunker buzzed with quiet murmurs from the survivors. They had grown from a handful of desperate individuals to a ragtag army, all rallying behind Ethan and his unique power. The ability to manipulate the threads had transformed him into more than just a scavenger. He was a symbol of hope, something they had long since forgotten. But Ethan knew that hope alone wouldn't win the war. "We'll need a plan," Ethan said, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. Calder nodded, his brow furrowed. "The fortress is heavily fortified. Spiders and drones patrol every inch of it. Even getting close will be nearly impossible." "Nearly," Ethan corrected, his fingers unconsciously twitching as he spun a small thread between them. "But not impossible." Mara leaned forward, her sharp eyes narrowing. "You're talking about going in alone, aren't you?" Ethan met her gaze, unflinching. "I can move through the webs like they do. If anyone stands a chance of getting in undetected, it's me." "But I won't be alone," Mara smirked, her lips curving into a grim smile. "Damn right, you won't be. I'm coming with you." Calder sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "This isn't a decision to be taken lightly." "If we fail, we won't fail," Ethan interrupted, though doubt gnawed at the back of his mind. "This is what we've been building toward. Every raid, Every trip it's all been leading up to this. If we don't take out Nyxia now, we're finished. The room fell silent. Everyone knew the truth of Ethan's words. The resistance had grown bolder, but so had the spiders' response. It was only a matter of time before Nyxia found them, crushed them, and snuffed out the last remnants of humanity. Ethan stood, the decision made. We move at dawn. Gather everyone who's ready. We'll hit the fortress with everything we've got. The night passed slowly, the air thick with anticipation and fear. Ethan barely slept, his mind racing with the possibilities of what could go wrong. He knew the risks at every step of the way would be fraught with danger. But as dawn broke, there was no time for second guessing. The small group of rebels gathered at the bunker's entrance. Ethan, Mara, and a handful of others who had volunteered for the mission. Faces grim, but resolute. Dr. Calder handed Ethan a small device, no bigger than a palm. The disruptor, Calder explained. It's not much, but it'll interfere with Nyxia's communication network long enough for you to get close. Once you're inside, plant it in the heart of the fortress. It should cut off her link to the drones. Ethan nodded, tucking the device into his belt. And after that? After that, Mara said with a fierce grin, we take her down. They moved quickly, navigating through the ruined city streets, keeping to the shadows as the sun climbed higher in the sky. The webs were everywhere, hanging like sinister decorations across the abandoned buildings. But Ethan led them through, weaving around the threads with an ease that still amazed his companions. He could feel them now, pulsing in the air, alive with some dark energy that only he seemed able to sense. As they neared the central web fortress, Ethan motioned for the group to halt. The structure loomed ahead, a massive dome of interconnected webs and broken stone. It looked like a monstrous hive, pulsating with life. Spiders, both drones and soldiers, crawled over its surface, patrolling its perimeter. Ethan took a deep breath, steeling himself. This is it. Stick to the plan. I'll move ahead and disable the communication network. Once I give the signal, we move in. The group nodded, faces tense but determined. With a final glance at Mara, Ethan stepped forward, weaving his way through the webs toward the fortress. His fingers worked instinctively, manipulating the threads to part before him, leaving no trace of his presence. He moved silently, his heart pounding in his chest as he slipped past the patrolling drones, each one a hair's breadth from spotting him. Inside the fortress, the air was thick and humid, the webs glowing with an airy light. Ethan could feel Nyxia's presence, a cold, calculating intelligence that permeated the space. She knew something was coming, and he could sense her awareness, but she hadn't found him yet. He reached the central chamber, a vast hollow within the heart of the fortress. In the center, a massive web hung like a chandelier, its strands pulsating with energy. This was Ida, the core of Nyxia's control network. Ethan pulled the disruptor from his belt, his hands shaking slightly as he approached the web. He had one chance. See if the device didn't work, if Nyxia sensed him before it activated, they were all dead. With a quick motion, he planted the disruptor in the web and activated it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the web shuddered, its glow dimming as the device pulsed with a low hum. The connection was severed. Ethan exhaled in relief. He tapped his earpiece. It's done. Move in. Outside, the rebels surged forward, their weapons raised as they stormed the fortress. Without Nyxia's control, the drones faltered, their movements erratic and disoriented. Mara led the charge, cutting through the spiders with brutal efficiency as they pushed toward the central chamber. Ethan wasn't far behind, weaving through the chaos as he made his way back to the others. But as he entered the chamber, a cold, sharp voice echoed in his mind. You think you've won, little human? Ethan froze, his heart lurching. Nyxia. She was still connected. From the shadows, the Spider Queen emerged, her massive form descending from the ceiling, her black eyes fixed on him with a malevolent gaze. She was larger than any of the other spiders, her body gleaming with a dark, iridescent sheen. And unlike the drones, she moved with terrifying precision. You've only delayed the inevitable, Nyxia hissed, her voice like the scraping of metal. "You cannot stop me." Ethan's mind raced. The disruptor had worked. Nyxia's connection to the drones was severed. But she was still here, still powerful. He backed away slowly, his fingers twitching as he prepared to summon the threads. "You're wrong," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the fear tightening in his chest. "This ends now." Nyxia lunged, her massive legs slicing through the air as she attacked. Ethan reacted instinctively, his hands moving in a blur as he summoned the threads, weaving them into a thick barrier that blocked her strike. But Nyxia was relentless, her attacks coming faster and harder with each passing second. Ethan fought back with everything he had, using the threads to entangle her legs, to strike back with sharp webs that cut through the air. But Nyxia was stronger than any spiders he had faced before. She tore through his webs with ease, her movements fluid and deadly. "You are nothing," Nyxia spat, her eyes gleaming with hatred. "Just another insect to crush." Ethan gritted his teeth, his muscles burning as he fought to keep up. He could feel himself weakening, his control over the thread slipping as Nyxia closed in. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw Mara. She had made it to the chamber, her weapon raised as she charged toward Nyxia. "Mara, no!" Ethan shouted, but it was too late. Nyxia whipped around, her legs striking Mara with bone-crushing force. Mara was thrown across the chamber, her body slamming into the wall with a sickening thud. Ethan's heart stopped, rage flooded through him, his vision narrowing as he stared at Nyxia, his hands trembling with fury. "You a broken bar." Ethan's voice was low, trembling with anger. "You won't take anyone else." With a surge of adrenaline, Ethan pushed past his limits, summoning every ounce of strength he had left. The threads shot from his fingers, faster and thicker than ever before, wrapping around Nyxia's legs and body. She screeched, thrashing wildly as the webs tightened, binding her in place. Ethan moved quickly, weaving the threads into a complex pattern, trapping Nyxia in a cocoon of her own making. She struggled, her body convulsing as she fought to break free, but the webs held firm. "You will not win!" Nyxia screamed, her voice filled with desperation. Ethan stood over her, his chest heaving as he stared into her black, soulless eyes. "I already have." With a final motion, Ethan tightened the webs, crushing the life out of the Spider Queen. Nyxia's body went still, her legs twitching once before collapsing. It was over. Ethan collapsed to his knees, his body trembling with exhaustion. The chamber was silent, the only sound the faint hum of the disruptor in the background. The fortress was still. He looked over at Mara, relief flooding through him as he saw her stir, groaning as she pushed herself to her feet. "Nice save," she muttered. Alt-wink-ing as she stood. Ethan smiled weakly. "Couldn't have done it without you." The others soon joined them, their faces a mixture of disbelief and triumph. They had done it. Nyxia was dead. The spider's reign was over. Weeks later, the world began to rebuild. The survivors emerged from the ruins, their hope rekindled as they worked together to restore what had been lost. The webs that once covered the cities were cleared away, and for the first time in years, the sky was visible again. Ethan stood on a crumbling rooftop, looking out over the city. The sun was setting, casting a golden light over the broken landscape. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Mara joined him, her arm in a sling but a smile on her face. "Not bad, Spider-Man." Ethan chuckled. "Don't start with that." She shrugged. "Hey, it fits." He looked out at the horizon, his mind already turning to the future. There was still so much to do, so much to rebuild. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hope. "We're gonna make it," he said quietly. Mara nodded. "Yeah, we are." And together, they watched the sun dip below the horizon, the world theirs to reclaim. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The late evening streets of New Haven were quiet as Dr. Ethan Collins trudged through the rain-soaked pavement toward his lab. The city skyline shimmered with the reflection of neon signs, casting a faint glow on the glassy streets. A faint drizzle had coated the sidewalks, the soft hiss of rainfall a distant companion to the scientist's solitary walk. His shoulders were hunched, hands buried in the pockets of his coat, not just against the cold but also against the weight of everything he'd lost. It had been 6 months since the accident, 6 months since he'd buried his wife, Ellen, in a small, quiet ceremony attended by a handful of colleagues and a world that barely noticed. The grief had driven Ethan to work longer hours, to bury himself in his research as a way to dull the pain, but tonight something felt different. Something tugged at the edges of his mind, an unease he couldn't quite explain. He arrived at his lab, a high-tech facility funded by a private corporation with interests in cutting-edge genetic research. Inside, the sterile fluorescent lights flickered on as he moved through the main hallway, his footsteps echoing through the empty space. His work centered around one project, the study of spider DNA, with the aim of discovering ways to enhance human biology. It was Ethan's theory that by splicing certain traits from spiders' strength, agility, healing properties, he could unlock new capabilities for human beings, maybe even save lives. Lives like Ellen's. Tonight, though, something felt off. A nagging itch at the back of his mind grew stronger as he approached his workstation. There was a vial on the counter, an experimental serum that had only been tested on a handful of lab animals, but tonight he felt an irrational urge, a compulsion, to push forward with human trials. As he stared at the vial, he thought of Ellen again. How helpless he had felt as the doctors had struggled to save her after the accident. With a shaking hand, Ethan reached for the vial. His mind raced, a storm of grief and ambition swirling inside him. Was it worth the risk? Could this serum be the breakthrough he'd been waiting for? He hesitated, but something, whether it was guilt, sorrow, or reckless hope, pushed him forward. Before he could stop himself, he had injected the serum into his arm. At first, nothing happened. The lab remained eerily silent, save for the distant hum of machinery. Ethan stood there, staring at his arm, waiting for some sign of change. Minutes passed, and he felt nothing unusual. He let out a heavy sigh, shaking his head at his own impulsiveness. Maybe it was just his exhaustion playing tricks on him. But then it started. A sharp pain shot through his veins, like fire spreading through his bloodstream. He doubled over, clutching his stomach as his muscles seized and his body convulsed. His vision blurred, his senses overwhelmed by a wave of nausea and dizziness. He tried to stand, but his legs buckled beneath him, sending him crashing to the floor. Through the haze of pain, Ethan could feel his body changing. His skin prickled as if tiny barbs were emerging from within, and his muscles tightened, then relaxed in a way that felt unnatural. The agony was excruciating, but somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew he had crossed a line tonight, a one he could never come back from. The next morning, Ethan awoke on the cold lab floor, his body aching but alive. Groaning, he sat up and looked around. The lab was intact, though papers and equipment had been scattered in his collapse. He felt disoriented, as if he had been asleep for days. His skin still tingled with the memory of the serum coursing through him, but otherwise, he felt fine, or so he thought. As he stood and began cleaning up the mess, he noticed something strange. He was moving faster, more fluidly than he had before. His hands darted from one piece of equipment to another with a grace and speed that felt foreign to him. It wasn't just his hands, his entire body felt lighter, stronger. He experimentally leapt across the room, and to his astonishment, he cleared the distance effortlessly, landing on the opposite side without so much as a sound. Ethan's heart raced. He wasn't just imagining this. The serum had done something extraordinary. Grabbing a nearby microscope, he examined a sample of his own blood, and his findings confirmed it. His DNA had begun to integrate with the spider genes he had been studying. His muscles were denser, his reflexes faster, and his senses sharper. He could hear the faintest hum of machinery down the hall, feel the vibrations of footsteps from across the building. And then, as if by instinct, Ethan raised his hand, and from his wrist, A thread of webbing shot out, sticking to the ceiling above. He yanked on it, and the web held firm, strong enough to support his weight. He stared in disbelief, his heart pounding in his chest. He had become something more. The thrill of discovery surged through him, but with it came a rush of fear. What had he done to himself? This power, it was incredible, but also dangerous. He had to understand it, control it. Over the next several days, Ethan secluded himself in the lab, running tests on his new abilities. He found that he could generate webs at will, his reflexes were heightened to the point where he could dodge objects with ease, and he could sense danger moments before it occurred. But as he grew more comfortable with his abilities, the sense of unease from the night of the serum returned, gnawing at him. Something was coming. He could feel it, an impending threat that loomed on the horizon, just out of sight. It wasn't long before his fears were realized. One evening, while testing his agility by leaping between skyscrapers in the city, Ethan noticed a strange disturbance in the sky. At first, it looked like a meteor shower of streaks of light hurtling toward Earth at impossible speeds. But as the objects drew closer, he realized they weren't meteors at all. They were creatures. Giant, monstrous spiders descended from the sky, their massive bodies crashing into the streets below, sending pedestrians fleeing in terror. These spiders were unlike anything Ethan had ever seen, far larger and more aggressive than any species on Earth. Their exoskeletons shimmered with a metallic sheen, and their eyes glowed with an unnatural, alien light. Panic spread through the city as the spiders began attacking, tearing through cars and buildings with terrifying ease. The military was called in, but their bullets and weapons seemed to have little effect on the creatures, whose armored exoskeletons deflected the gunfire. Ethan watched in horror from above, his mind racing. These spiders said they weren't from Earth, and they weren't acting on their own. He could feel a connection between him and these creatures, as if they shared the same genetic source. His powers, his abilities, they weren't an accident. They were part of something much bigger. Suddenly, he felt a sharp pang in his chest, a sense of danger, more intense than anything he had felt before. He turned just in time to see one of the alien spiders leaping toward him from a nearby building, its massive fangs bared. Without thinking, Ethan shot a web at the creature, swinging out of the way as it crashed into the side of the building. He landed on a rooftop, breathing hard, his mind racing. This was it. The threat he had sensed for days. The alien spiders had arrived, and they were here for a reason. As the city below descended into chaos, Ethan knew he had no choice. He couldn't just stand by and watch as these creatures tore the world apart. He had been given these powers for a reason, whether he liked it or not. He was the only one who could stop them. Taking a deep breath, Ethan shot a web into the sky and swung into the fray, ready to face the invasion head-on. Ethan landed gracefully in the middle of the street, crouching low as the ground shook beneath him. One of the massive alien spiders skittered forward, its legs like towering columns of steel, its exoskeleton gleaming under the flickering city lights. Its 8 glowing eyes fixed on him, and for the first time since he gained his powers, Ethan felt a genuine surge of fear. But there was no time for fear. The people of New Haven were running for their lives, screaming as the creature lashed out with its razor-sharp legs, toppling cars and smashing through storefronts. Ethan reacted on instinct, launching himself toward the spider. His web shot out in a fluid arc, wrapping around the spider's front legs. He yanked hard, pulling the creature off balance, and it screeched as it stumbled to the ground. As the spider thrashed, trying to regain its footing, Ethan leapt onto its back, his enhanced reflexes allowing him to dodge its snapping fangs with ease. He slammed his fist into its armored exoskeleton, but it barely left a mark. The creature was too well protected. He needed to find a weak spot. Before he could strategize further, another spider emerged from the alley, charging toward him. Ethan narrowly avoided its attack, flipping backward and landing on a nearby lamppost. His mind raced. He couldn't take on all of these creatures alone, not like this. Just then, He heard the sound of gunfire. A squad of police officers had arrived on the scene, led by Detective Sarah Blake, a sharp-eyed, no-nonsense woman with a reputation for keeping the peace in New Haven. She and her team opened fire on the spiders, but their bullets ricocheted harmlessly off the creature's armor. "Fall back!" Sarah yelled, motioning for her officers to retreat as the spiders advanced. But Ethan wasn't about to let them become prey. He swung down from the lamppost, landing between the officers and the spiders. "Get back! I'll handle this!" he shouted. Sarah looked at him, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Who the hell are you?" "Doesn't matter, just trust me," Ethan replied, dodging another spider's lunge. He fired a web at the creature's eyes, temporarily blinding it, before turning back to Sarah. "You need to get your men out of here. It's not safe." Sarah hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Fall back, everyone." Now, as the officers retreated, Ethan focused on the approaching spiders. His mind raced through everything he knew about spiders, searching for a strategy. He needed to exploit their biology and find a way to turn their own strengths against them. Then it hit him. Their exoskeletons were nearly impenetrable, but their joints at the areas where the legs connected to the body were softer, more vulnerable. If he could disable their legs, they wouldn't be able to move, let alone attack. With renewed determination, Ethan launched himself at the nearest spider. He landed on its back and immediately fired webs at the joints of its legs, wrapping them tightly in the sticky strands. The spider screeched and thrashed, but its movements became sluggish as Ethan bound its limbs one by one. Within moments, the creature collapsed, immobilized. Ethan barely had time to breathe before the second spider was upon him. He repeated the process, targeting its legs with precise webs, binding it until it too fell to the ground. As he stood panting in the middle of the street, surrounded by the fallen creatures, Sarah approached him cautiously. "Okay, I've seen a lot of things in this city, but that a broken bar," she gestured to the webbed up spiders. "That's new." "What the hell are these things?" "I don't know exactly," Ethan admitted, his mind still reeling from the chaos. "But they're not from this planet. And they're not alone. There's more coming." Sarah's expression darkened. "So this is an invasion?" "Looks like it," Ethan replied grimly. Before they could say more, the ground shook violently, and a deafening roar echoed through the city. Ethan and Sarah turned to see a massive spider, easily twice the size of the others, emerging from the shadows. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent intelligence, and its legs clattered against the pavement with a chilling rhythm. "That's not good," Sarah muttered, her hand instinctively reaching for her sidearm, even though she knew it would be useless. Ethan clenched his fists, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This was the queen, and he could sense it. The hive mind behind the invasion. If he didn't stop her, the city would fall. Without another word, Ethan swung toward the queen, his webs latching onto a nearby building. He landed on her back, but before he could make a move, she spun around, throwing him off with a violent shake. He crashed into the side of a building, the impact knocking the wind out of him. The queen spider advanced, her enormous fangs dripping with venom. Ethan struggled to his feet, but he was dazed, his vision swimming. The queen lunged at him, and he barely managed to roll out of the way in time. From the corner of his eye, he saw Sarah standing her ground, firing her gun at the queen in a futile attempt to distract her. "Get out of here!" Ethan shouted, pushing himself to his feet. "You're going to get yourself killed." "I'm not leaving you alone with that thing," Sarah yelled back, reloading her weapon. Ethan cursed under his breath. He didn't have time to argue. He needed to end this now. Ignoring the pain in his ribs, Ethan fired a web at the queen's face, blinding her momentarily. He used the distraction to launch himself onto her back again, this time gripping tightly with his hands and feet. He fired web after web at her legs, binding her joints just as he had with the others, but the queen was stronger, smarter. She thrashed violently, throwing him off balance. As he struggled to hold on, Ethan noticed something at the queen's abdomen, where her body connected to her spinnerets. was glowing faintly. It was a weak point, exposed and vulnerable. Taking a deep breath, Ethan fired one last web at the queen's legs, then launched himself toward her abdomen. He landed directly on the glowing spot and drove his fist into it with all the strength he could muster. The queen let out a deafening screech, her body convulsing as the force of Ethan's blow sent shock waves through her system. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze, the queen's massive form trembling as if on the verge of collapse. And then, with one final shudder, the queen spider crumpled to the ground. Ethan stumbled back, breathing hard, his entire body aching. He watched as the remaining alien spiders around the city began to falter, their movements sluggish and disoriented. Without the queen's control, they were lost. The battle was over. Sarah approached him, her face a mixture of relief and disbelief. "Did you a broken bar? Did you just kill that thing?" Ethan nodded, wiping the sweat from his brow. "Yeah, I guess I did." For a moment, they stood in silence, the destruction around them a grim reminder of the cost of victory. The streets were littered with debris, and the distant wail of sirens filled the air. "We'll need to call in the National Guard, maybe even the military," Sarah said quietly, her eyes scanning the ruined city. "This isn't over, is it?" Ethan shook his head. This was just the first wave. There's more out there, and they'll be back." Sarah turned to him, her eyes hard but determined. "Then we fight together." Ethan looked at her, surprised by her resolve. He hadn't expected an ally, let alone someone like Sarah. But as he stood there, surrounded by the aftermath of the invasion, he realized that he couldn't do this alone. He wasn't just a scientist anymore. He was something more. He nodded. Together. As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, Ethan and Sarah stood side by side, ready to face whatever came next. The war for Earth had only just begun. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. In the dimly lit laboratory of a small university on the outskirts of town, Alex Manning found himself surrounded by specimens of spiders from every corner of the world. His fascination with arachnids had been a lifelong obsession and not hobby, most would say. But for Alex, spiders held a strange allure, one that beckoned him deeper into the mysteries of nature. He tapped away at his laptop, documenting patterns and behaviors from his latest research when something strange caught his eye. There, lying in the back of a drawer he'd never bothered to open, was a small, ornate amulet. It looked ancient, with intricate web-like designs engraved into its surface. A tiny gemstone rested in its center, glowing faintly in the sterile light of the lab. He reached for it, his fingers brushing the cold metal. Suddenly, the room began to swirl around him, his vision blurred, his body felt weightless, and the world as he knew it dissolved into darkness. When his eyes snapped open again, he wasn't in his lab anymore. Alex found himself standing in a world both strange and terrifying. The sky above him was a swirling mass of dark clouds, streaked with silver lines that shimmered like spider silk. Towering webs crisscrossed the horizon, stretching between giant, gnarled trees with bark as black as night. Shadows moved in the distance, large, many-legged creatures that crept through the underbrush, their eyes glowing in the dim light. "What the hell?" Alex muttered, his heart pounding in his chest. Before he could make sense of his surroundings, a massive spider emerged from the shadows, its body the size of a small car. He froze, unable to move as it approached, but there was something different about this creature. Its eyes gleamed with intelligence, and when it spoke, its voice resonated directly in Alex's mind. "Do not be afraid, human," the spider said. "I am Arachnus, leader of the eight-legged clan. You have been chosen." "Chosen? Chosen for what?" Alex stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "To become the guardian of the spider realm," Arachnus continued, moving closer. "There is an ancient pact that binds our worlds together, yours and mine. The amulet you found is the key to that pact, and by touching it, you have accepted its power." Alex felt a strange warmth radiating from the amulet, which now hung around his neck as if it had always been there. His body tingled, His senses heightened, and a strange connection to the world around him bloomed in his mind. "I didn't ask for this," Alex said, taking a step back, his mind racing. "I don't even know what this place is." "This is the spider realm, a dimension parallel to your own," Arachnis explained, her legs moving in fluid, precise motions. "For centuries, the balance between our realms has been maintained. But there are forces, dark, twisted forces that seek to disrupt that balance and invade your world. Only the Guardian can stop them." Alex swallowed hard, his mind spinning. He had come here by accident. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was just a scientist, not some mythical protector. "I don't know how to fight," he said, shaking his head. "You will learn," Arachnis replied, her eyes narrowing. "The power of the spider realm now flows through you. With my guidance, you will master it. But you must act quickly." Silthr, the renegade warlord, has already begun his invasion. At the mention of Silthr's name, Alex felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't know who or what Silthr was, but the weight of Arachnis's words made it clear. This was no ordinary villain. The next thing Alex knew, he was back in his lab. The fluorescent lights flickered above, and everything looked the same as it had before except now, he wore the amulet, and his mind was filled with the strange events that had just occurred. For a moment, he wondered if he had dreamt the entire experience. But when he looked at his hands, he knew it was real. His fingers twitched, and as if by instinct, a thin, silver thread shot out from his palm, weaving itself into a delicate web. He stared in disbelief. "I'm not imagining this," he muttered. Arachnis's voice echoed in his mind. "The power of the spider realm is now yours. Use it wisely." Alex spent the next few days trying to adjust to his new reality. He continued his work at the university, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something dark was lurking just beyond the veil of his world. He noticed strange occurrences, or people collapsing with no clear cause, mysterious webs appearing in alleyways, and whispers of creatures stalking the night. One evening, as he walked home from the lab, a scream pierced the quiet. Alex's heart raced, and before he knew it, he was sprinting toward the sound. When he turned the corner, his eyes widened in horror. A monstrous spider, far larger than any natural creature, was attacking a group of people, its legs lashing out with terrifying speed. Without thinking, Alex felt a surge of energy course through him. His body moved on instinct as webs shot from his hands, entangling the creature and pulling it away from its victims. The spider screeched, its many eyes locking onto Alex. For a moment, he froze. But then Arachnis's voice filled his mind once more. "Trust in your powers, Guardian." With newfound confidence, Alex engaged the creature in battle. He swung through the air on threads of webbing, dodging the spider's attacks and delivering powerful blows. It was as if he had been doing this his entire life. Within minutes, the creature was subdued, and Alex stood victorious. But the victory felt hollow. This was just the beginning. The attack on the streets wasn't an isolated incident. Over the next few weeks, reports of strange, spider-like creatures surfaced all over the city. Alex knew that Silthr's forces were growing stronger, and it wouldn't be long before the barrier between the spider realm and the real world collapsed completely. One night, as he returned to his apartment, a knock on his door startled him. When he opened it, he found a woman standing there, her expression serious. "Alex Manning?" she asked, her voice firm but calm. "Who's asking?" Alex replied, eyeing her warily. "My name is Sarah. I work for a group called the Web Watchers. We've been monitoring your activities for a while now." "Web Watchers?" Alex frowned. "What the hell is that?" "We're an organization dedicated to protecting the world from threats like Silthr," Sarah explained, stepping inside. "We've known about the spider realm for centuries, and we've been fighting to keep the balance ever since." "You're not the first Guardian, Alex, but you might be the most important one." Alex's mind whirled with questions. "Why didn't anyone warn me about this sooner?" "I didn't ask for any of this." Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder, her gaze softening. "No one ever asks to be the guardian, but the amulet chose you for a reason. And now, we're here to help." Over the next few days, Sarah introduced Alex to the WebWatchers, an eclectic group of scientists, cryptozoologists, and warriors, all dedicated to keeping the spider realm's forces at bay. With their guidance, Alex trained rigorously, learning how to better control his powers, how to navigate between dimensions, and how to anticipate Silthra's moves. But time was running out. Alex stood at the edge of the abandoned warehouse where Sarah had tracked Silthra's forces. His heart pounded in his chest, the weight of the amulet heavier than ever around his neck. He knew this was it. If Silthra succeeded in opening the rift between the dimensions, the real world would be overrun. Humanity would have no defense against the creatures of the spider realm. Arachnis's voice echoed in his mind. "You must act now, Guardian. The rift is already forming. If it opens fully, there will be no way to close it." "I know," Alex muttered, tightening his grip on the webbing that now felt like an extension of his own body. "I just hope I'm ready for this." Beside him, Sarah adjusted her tactical gear. The WebWatchers had armed themselves with experimental technology and energy weapons that had been tested on smaller spider realm creatures, but nothing on the scale of what they might face tonight. "Ready?" Sarah asked, her voice calm despite the tension in the air. "Let's do this," Alex replied. Together, they moved silently toward the warehouse. The night was unusually still, a suffocating quiet that made the hair on the back of Alex's neck stand on end. Inside, they could hear the faint chittering of the spider creatures, the telltale sound of webs being spun. As they entered the building, the scene that greeted them was worse than Alex had imagined. The walls were covered in thick, pulsating webs that shimmered with a dark energy. In the center of the warehouse stood a massive stone altar, covered in ancient symbols. Around it, Silthra's minions worked tirelessly, chanting in a language Alex didn't understand, their many legs scuttling across the ground as they completed the final steps of the ritual. And there, standing atop the altar, was Silthra himself. The warlord was larger than any spider creature Alex had seen before, his body a grotesque fusion of arachnid and human-like features. His eyes, all 8 of them, glowed a sickly yellow, and his limbs moved with terrifying precision as he orchestrated the ritual. "You're too late, Guardian," Silthra hissed, his voice reverberating through the warehouse. "The rift will open, and your world will be mine." Alex felt a surge of panic but quickly shoved it down. This was what he had trained for, what Arachnis had prepared him for. He couldn't afford to hesitate now. Without a word, Alex launched himself into the air, his webs propelling him toward Silthra. But the warlord was ready. With a flick of one of his legs, Silthra sent a wave of dark energy toward Alex, knocking him back into the far wall with a sickening thud. Pain shot through Alex's body, but he gritted his teeth and forced himself to stand. He could see the rift forming above the altar, a swirling vortex of shadow and light. If it opened completely, there would be no stopping the invasion. "Focus," Arachnis's voice urged him. "The power of the spider realm flows through you. Use it." Alex steadied his breathing and closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the energy of the realm surge through his veins. When he opened them again, his vision sharpened, and his body felt lighter, more agile. He could sense the threads of the web around him, the connections between the dimensions, and the flow of energy that powered the rift. With renewed determination, Alex launched another attack, this time anticipating Silthra's counterstrike. He twisted in midair, dodging the dark energy and landing a powerful blow to one of Silthra's legs, causing the warlord to screech in pain. Sarah and the WebWatchers moved in behind him, engaging Silthra's minions in battle. Energy blasts and webbing flew through the air as the two forces clashed, the sounds of battle echoing off the warehouse walls. But Silthra was relentless. Even as his minions fell, he continued the ritual, his chanting growing louder and more frantic as the rift widened. Alex knew they were running out of time. Thinking quickly, Alex focused his energy on the rift itself. He could feel the pull of the spider realm, the way the dimensions were connected by invisible threads. If he could disrupt those connections, maybe just maybe he could stop the rift from opening. He closed his eyes again, reaching out with his mind to the web of energy around him. It was a delicate balance. One wrong move and he could tear the fabric of both worlds apart. But with Arachnus guiding him, Alex found the weak points, the places where the connection between the realms was strongest. With a sharp tug, he pulled at the threads, unraveling the web that held the rift together. The vortex flickered, its light dimming as the connection began to fray. Silthra let out an enraged scream, his eyes locking onto Alex. "You cannot stop this, the realms will merge, and you will be nothing but a memory." But Alex wasn't listening. He could feel the rift weakening, the balance beginning to restore itself. With one final push, he severed the last of the threads, and the rift collapsed in on itself with a deafening roar. Silthra howled in fury as the dark energy surrounding him dissipated. His body, now weakened by the failed ritual, began to crumble. "This isn't over, Guardian," he spat, his voice filled with venom. "I will return, and when I do, your world will fall." With that, Silthra's form disintegrated, leaving nothing but a pile of ash on the altar. The battle was over. Alex stood in the center of the warehouse, breathing heavily as the adrenaline slowly drained from his body. The web watchers moved around him, securing the area and tending to the wounded, but Alex's mind was elsewhere. The rift was closed, and Silthra was gone for now. But the threat of the spider realm still lingered. There were other factions, other forces that could seek to use the realm's power for their own purposes. As if sensing his thoughts, Arachnus spoke. "You have done well, Guardian. But this is only the beginning. The balance between the realms must be maintained, and that is a task that will never truly end." Alex nodded, his gaze fixed on the spot where the rift had been. He knew Arachnus was right. His role as the Guardian wasn't over, it had only just begun. The web watchers gathered around him, their faces a mix of relief and gratitude. Sarah stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You did it," she said softly. "You stopped him." "For now," Alex replied, his voice quiet. "But there will be others," Sarah nodded. "And we'll be ready." "You're not in this alone." Alex glanced at the amulet around his neck, its once glowing gemstone now dim. He had been chosen for a reason, and though the weight of that responsibility was heavy, he knew he couldn't walk away from it. The spider realm still held many secrets, and Alex was determined to uncover them both for his world's sake and for his own. As the night stretched on, he stood with his allies, knowing that whatever came next, he would face it head on. The guardian of the spider realm would always be there to protect the balance, no matter the cost. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The city loomed over Evanlock like a beast in slumber, every building a jagged fang in the skyline, every street a winding artery pumping with life. Neon lights flickered in the haze, casting shifting shadows over the narrow alleyways where crime thrived, unnoticed by the wealthy above. In the underbelly of the metropolis, whispers of a string of mysterious disappearances had begun to surface. To most, these were just rumors, urban legends twisted by paranoia, but to Evan, they felt like the first strands of a web wrapping around the city, tightening with each new case. And he was about to be caught right in the middle of it. It was late evening when Evan met his client, a woman whose eyes were red from crying. Her brother, just like so many others, had vanished without a trace. No leads, no ransom note, Tessa just gone. She had come to Evan in desperation, unable to trust the city's police force, who were either indifferent or quietly paid off by the shadowy organizations that controlled the city. "They say it's connected to something old," she whispered as they sat in his small, dimly lit office, the scent of stale coffee filling the air. "I don't know what, but I've heard people talk about a spider." "Something about spiders." Evan leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. Spiders? That's a new one. You sure they weren't talking about gangs? She shook her head, her hands trembling. It's not just street talk. It's something bigger than that. They're afraid, but they won't say why. Please. I need to know what happened to my brother. Evan nodded, scribbling notes down as the woman left. The door clicked shut, and silence fell over the office, save for the hum of the city outside. He had been chasing these strange disappearances for weeks, and the more he dug, the less he found. Each missing person left behind the same cryptic Jella an abandoned apartment, personal belongings untouched, and, in a few cases, strange symbols left behind. Symbols like webs. He had a hunch, one he didn't quite like, but it was enough to get him moving. The investigation took him deep into the heart of the city, where the walls closed in, and every alley felt like a tunnel to another world. He traced the last known location of the missing brother to a rundown bar near the district border. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and whispered deals, and the bartender barely looked up as Evan slid into a booth in the corner. "Seen the sky?" Evan asked, tossing a photograph onto the table. The bartender glanced at it, then turned away. "Nah, lots of people come through here." Evan wasn't surprised by the lack of cooperation. It was part of the game in this city. But something in the bartender's stiffened shoulders told Evan he knew more than he was letting on. Evan reached into his jacket, pulling out a few bills and placing them on the bar. The bartender's eyes flicked to the money, and after a long pause, he leaned in close. "You didn't hear it from me," he muttered, "but people like him? They've been going missing near the old cathedral, down by the waterfront. No one goes there anymore. Too many stories." "What kind of stories?" "Ones that'll get you killed if you ask too many questions." Evan pocketed the photograph and the lead. It wasn't much, but it was something. The old cathedral had been abandoned for years, long forgotten by the city's planners, and now standing as a crumbling relic, looming over the darkened waterfront like a monument to forgotten gods. The waterfront district had always been a quiet part of town, not because of its isolation but because most of its buildings were either condemned or left to rot by businesses that couldn't keep up with the demands of the city's elite. As Evan approached the cathedral, the air grew colder, and the feeling of being watched crawled over his skin. The faint sound of water lapping against the docks echoed in the silence as the wind whispered through the broken windows of the towering structure. He stepped through the crumbling doorway, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. The cathedral was eerily silent, its high ceilings casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. Pews were overturned, and the once grand altar stood broken, like the remains of a forgotten faith. But what caught Evan's eye were the symbols. They were everywhere, carved into the stone walls, scrawled in faded paint. The webs, intricate and sprawling, were more than just symbols. They were warnings, or perhaps invitations, into something far darker than he could imagine. The floorboards creaked underfoot as he moved deeper into the cathedral, his senses on high alert. That's when he saw eye to something glinting in the faint light beneath the cracked pew. Bending down, Evan picked up a small metallic charm in the shape of a spider, its legs curled inwards as if guarding something. A cold breeze swept through the room, and with it came a sound that sent a chill down his spine, a faint clicking, like the skittering of legs on stone. He turned sharply, his flashlight flickering as it caught movement in the shadows. For a moment, he thought he saw something, a figure, distorted and hunched, moving with unnatural speed across the far wall. But as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, leaving only the silence behind. Evan's pulse quickened. He knew there was something more to this case than just a missing person. Something ancient and deadly was stalking the city, and it had left its mark here in this cathedral. His instincts told him to leave, to get out before whatever it was came back. But another part of him, the part that always got him into trouble, urged him to stay, to dig deeper. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the edge of uncovering something far bigger than a simple disappearance. As he moved to leave, something else caught his eye, an old, dusty book lying open on the floor near the altar. The pages were brittle with age, but the words were clear enough. Ancient symbols, rituals, and a name. The spider god. Evan's fingers traced the faded ink as a strange sensation rippled through his body. His heart pounded in his chest, and for a brief moment, he felt an odd pressure in his hands. Glancing down, his breath caught in his throat. Then, nearly invisible strands of silk-like webbing were stretching between his fingers, clinging to his skin. "What the hell, a broken bar," he muttered, shaking his hands. But the webbing didn't disappear. Instead, it grew stronger, more tangible. His body reacted, muscles tightening as if awakening to something long dormant. Instinctively, he reached out, and the webbing shot from his hand, attaching itself to a nearby pillar. Shocked, Evan yanked his hand back, and the webbing retracted, pulling him with it. His body moved with unnatural agility, landing lightly on the floor as if he weighed nothing. Fear and confusion warred within him, but beneath that, something else stirred, a curiosity. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew it was connected to the case, to the cult, and to the strange symbols that had been haunting his investigation. He had to find out more. The widow was his only lead now. She was a shadow in the city's criminal underworld, a figure who trafficked in knowledge too dangerous for most to seek. Evan had worked with her before, and though he didn't trust her, he knew she might have answers. The streets blurred as Evan made his way to her hideout, his mind racing with questions. How long had he been capable of these spider-like powers? And why were they manifesting now, at the exact moment he was closing in on the cult? When he arrived at the widow's lair, an old warehouse turned fortress, she greeted him with her usual cryptic smile. "I've been expecting you, Locke," she said, her voice low and measured. "You've finally stumbled upon the truth, haven't you?" Evan didn't bother with pleasantries. "What the hell is happening to me?" She motioned for him to sit, her sharp eyes studying him. "The cult you're chasing isn't just some French group. They've been around for centuries, hidden in the shadows, pulling the strings of this city. And you," she paused, leaning forward, "you're tied to them, more than you know." The widow's words hit Evan harder than any punch he'd ever taken. "Tied to them, more than you know?" His stomach churned as she stared at him, eyes gleaming with some kind of dark knowledge. He didn't want to believe her, but the web-like strands clinging to his fingers were hard to ignore. "What do you mean, tied to them?" His voice came out sharper than he intended, a mix of fear and anger bubbling just under the surface. She chuckled softly, as if his frustration amused her. "The cult you're chasing doesn't just worship the spider god, Evan. They believe in a prophecy about someone with the power to either bring their god into this world or destroy it. You didn't just stumble into this case by accident. You were drawn to it because you're part of that prophecy." Evan felt a cold sweat forming on the back of his neck. "That's ridiculous, is it?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "Look at your hands. You're not just investigating them, Locke. You're becoming them." He flexed his fingers, watching the silk-like webbing materialize again between them. His mind raced as he tried to piece everything together. The disappearances, the cult, the powers. Were they connected to him in some way? Had this power always been inside him, dormant until now? The widow stood up and began rummaging through a stack of old books on a nearby table. She tossed one toward him, and he caught it, barely glancing at the cover before opening it. Inside were pages filled with ancient symbols and illustrations of spider-like beings, a half-human, half-creature, their eyes dark and empty, their hands wrapped in webs. "This is what you're up against," she said. "The spider god is more than a myth. It's real, and its followers are preparing for a summoning ritual. That's what all these disappearances are for. They're gathering sacrifices." Evan's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't want to believe any of this, but the evidence was stacking up. The symbols he'd seen at the crime scenes, the strange abilities manifesting within him, the eerie silence that followed any mention of the spider god. It was all too real. "How do I stop it?" he asked, his voice low. The widow's expression darkened. "You may not be able to. The cult is powerful, and they're already deep into the summoning process. But there is one why a broken bar. She trailed off, and Evan's gaze snapped up to her. One way what? She hesitated for a moment before speaking again. If you can find the heart of the ritual, the place where they plan to bring the spider god into this world, you might be able to disrupt it. But it won't be easy. They'll be expecting you. Evan stood, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Where is it? The widow handed him a small map, marked with strange, spiraling lines that led to a point deep within the city. Here, beneath the city's central core. It's been hidden for centuries, but I've managed to piece together the location. If you're going to stop them, you need to go now. The ritual is said to happen tonight. Without another word, Evan turned and left the warehouse, the map clenched tightly in his hand. The streets seemed darker than usual, the neon lights casting twisted shadows as he made his way toward the city's central core. His mind raced as he tried to prepare himself for what was coming. He was walking into the heart of the cult, straight into their lair, and he didn't know what he would find once he got there. But one thing was clear: if he didn't stop the ritual, the city, and possibly the world, would be lost. As he approached the location marked on the map, he found himself standing in front of an old, decrepit building that looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The windows were boarded up, and the walls were covered in graffiti. But Evan could feel something broken by wrong about the place. There was an energy in the air, something dark and ancient lurking just beneath the surface. He pushed open the door, stepping into the building's dimly lit interior. Dust floated through the air, and the floorboards creaked beneath his feet. The place looked abandoned, but Evan knew better. He could feel eyes watching him from the shadows. The map led him deeper into the building, down a set of narrow stairs that descended into the earth. The air grew colder with each step, and the smell of damp stone filled his nostrils. His pulse quickened as he reached the bottom of the stairs and found himself standing in front of a massive metal door, its surface etched with the same spider symbols he had seen at the cathedral. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open. Inside was a vast, underground chamber, its walls lined with flickering torches that cast eerie shadows across the floor. At the center of the room was a stone altar, and surrounding it were hooded figures, their faces hidden in the darkness. On the altar lay one of the missing people, bound and unconscious, while the cultists chanted in a language Evan didn't understand. The leader of the cult stood at the far end of the room, his hands raised in the air as he recited the final words of the ritual. Evan recognized him immediately as Sci-FiWorlds, the man who had been behind so many of the city's darkest dealings. He had always suspected Varn was involved in something bigger, but he never imagined this. Evan's body tensed as he prepared to confront the cultists, his hands trembling with the energy surging through him. He had no idea how to stop the ritual, but he knew he had to try. Slowly, he stepped forward, his presence unnoticed in the chaos of the chanting. But then, Vorn's eyes snapped open, locking onto Evan with a cold, calculating stare. "So, you finally arrived," Vorn said, his voice echoing through the chamber. "I was wondering when you would show up, Detective." Evan's fists clenched, webs forming between his fingers. "It ends here, Vorn." Vorn chuckled darkly. "You don't understand, do you? This isn't just a summoning. This is destiny. The spider god will return, and you, Evan Locke, are the key to that return." Evan's mind raced. The key? What did that mean? Before he could process it, Vorn raised his hand, and the cultists began to move, their hoods falling back to reveal grotesque, spider-like faces. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and their mouths clicked with the sound of mandibles. Evan didn't wait for them to attack. He leapt into action, his body moving with a speed and agility that still felt foreign to him. His webs shot out, wrapping around one of the cultists and yanking him off his feet. Another lunged at him, but Evan dodged, flipping over the creature and landing in a crouch. The battle was chaotic, the room filled with the sounds of webs snapping and fists connecting with flesh. But Evan wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting to stop the ritual, to save the city from whatever horror Orn was trying to unleash. In the chaos, Evan noticed something at the altar. The chanting was centered around it, and he could feel the energy radiating from the stone. If he could destroy it, maybe he could disrupt the ritual. He fought his way through the cultists, his powers guiding him as he scaled the walls and swung across the chamber. With one final burst of strength, he landed on the altar, tearing at the stone with his webs. The energy pulsed beneath his fingers, and for a moment, he thought he had failed. But then, with a deafening crack, the altar shattered, sending a shock wave through the chamber. The cultists screamed as the ground beneath them trembled, their bodies disintegrating into dust as the ritual collapsed. Vorn, however, remained standing, his face twisted in rage. "You think this is over?" he spat. "The spider god cannot be stopped. Not by you. Not by anyone." Evan didn't respond. He lunged at Vorn, webbing him to the wall before he could react. The cult leader struggled, but Evan's strength was too much. With a final surge of power, Evan tightened the webs, silencing Vorn once and for all. The chamber fell silent. Evan stood in the wreckage of the ritual, his body shaking from the effort. The cult was destroyed, the summoning stopped, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. He could still feel the power coursing through him, the webs clinging to his skin. As he left the underground lair and stepped back into the cold night air, Evan knew that the battle wasn't truly over. The city was safe for now, but the spider god's influence still lingered in the shadows, and his powers, once dormant, were now awake. He looked down at his hands, the webs still glistening between his fingers. He was no longer just a detective. He was something more, something dangerous, and the city still needed him. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The planet Viridian shimmered in the distant light of its twin suns, a world of endless green and vibrant life. From orbit, the colonies looked like mere specks against the lush, rolling plains and towering forests. But down on the surface, it was a different story. The human presence on Viridian had grown into a sprawling network of mining outposts, research stations, and bustling markets, all thriving under the invisible web of energy that connected every living thing. Dr. Ethan Rains stood at the edge of one such outpost, staring out at the tangled network of vines and shimmering energy webs that spanned the horizon. He'd been on Viridian for nearly 5 years now, studying the strange phenomena that defied every known law of biology and physics. The energy webs, produced by the planet's native species, the arachnions, were unlike anything humanity had ever encountered. They connected entire ecosystems, allowing plants and animals to thrive in perfect balance, as if the planet itself were alive, consciously directing the flow of energy. "Ethan, you've been out here for hours. You should come in before the storms hit." Kara's voice crackled over his comm. Ethan turned, blinking as the setting suns cast a golden glow over the landscape. Kara had been his colleague for years, an environmental scientist who shared his fascination with Viridian's delicate ecosystems. But while she was always the voice of caution, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the verge of something monumental. "Just a few more minutes," Ethan replied, his gaze returning to the shimmering webs in the distance. "There's something different about the webs today. They're pulsing." Kara sighed, her voice softened. "I know you're close to a breakthrough, but it can wait until tomorrow. The Colony Council is meeting, and you know how they feel about delays in mining operations. They're expecting your report." Ethan frowned. The Colony Council, led by the ever-ambitious Saravana, had been pressuring him for months to weaponize the arachnions' webs. They saw the energy network as a potential tool for military and commercial exploitation, and with Viridian's rich resources at stake, they weren't about to let an alien ecosystem stand in their way. "I'll be there," Ethan muttered, turning to leave. "I just need a little more time." As he made his way back toward the outpost, the air around him hummed with the planet's energy. He could feel the webs beneath his feet, like a living network pulsing with life. He had spent years studying them, trying to understand how the arachnids' strange, spider-like creatures with bioluminescent bodies produced and maintained the webs. Yet, despite all their research, there was still so much they didn't know. Ethan stopped, his heart pounding as he caught sight of something unusual. A few yards away, tangled in one of the webs, was a large, injured arachnid. Its body flickered with weak pulses of light, and its long, slender legs twitched as it struggled to free itself from the web. Without thinking, Ethan rushed toward the creature. He had seen arachnids up close before, but never one in this condition. As he reached out to touch the web, a surge of energy shot through his body, sending a wave of pain coursing through his veins. He gasped, stumbling backward as his vision blurred. The arachnid let out a low, guttural sound, and Ethan's mind was flooded with images of alien landscapes, intricate webs, and a deep, primal connection to the planet itself. He could feel the creature's pain, its desperation, as if their minds had become one. "Ethan, what's going on out there?" Kara's voice sounded distant, muffled by the roaring storm that was beginning to build on the horizon. Ethan tried to respond, but the words wouldn't come. His body felt heavy, his limbs numb as the energy from the web continued to pulse through him. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the connection was severed. The arachnid went limp, its body falling still as the last of its light faded. Ethan collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. His heart raced as he struggled to make sense of what had just happened. His mind buzzed with the lingering remnants of the connection, and he could still feel the faint hum of the web beneath his skin. He had fused with the arachnid's energy, its genetic material somehow merging with his own. The realization hit him like a freight train. He wasn't just a scientist studying the webs anymore. He was part of them. By the time Kara arrived, the storm was in full swing, lightning crackling across the darkening sky. She found Ethan lying on the ground, his face pale, his body shaking as the energy coursed through him. "Ethan, what happened?" She knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she checked his pulse. "We need to get you inside." Ethan opened his eyes, the faint glow of the webs reflected in his irises. I touched it." The web. The arachnid. Something changed. Kara's expression shifted from concern to shock as she noticed the faint web-like patterns beginning to form on Ethan's skin. They were barely visible, but there, nonetheless, an intricate network of lines that seemed to pulse with energy. "Stay with me," Kara whispered, her voice tight with fear as she helped him to his feet. "We need to get you back to the lab." As they stumbled through the storm, Ethan's mind raced. He could feel the web inside him now, connecting him to the planet in ways he never thought possible. The arachnids had always been a mystery, but now, they were part of him. He was no longer just a mana, he was something more. But as the storm raged on, Ethan knew that his newfound connection to Viridian wouldn't remain a secret for long. The colony council had been watching his every move, and with Teravos breathing down his neck, it was only a matter of time before they tried to exploit his new abilities for their own gain. Ethan woke to the steady beeping of medical equipment and the soft hum of the lab's ventilation system. The pain had subsided, replaced by a dull ache that spread through his limbs, as if every cell in his body had been rearranged overnight. Kara hovered nearby, her eyes filled with worry. "You're awake," she said softly, stepping forward. "How do you feel?" Ethan sat up slowly, blinking as the faint traces of web-like patterns shimmered across his skin, barely visible under the harsh fluorescent lights. "Like I've been hit by a truck," he muttered, rubbing his head. "But it's more than that. Something's different." Kara nodded. "You've been out for nearly 2 days. Whatever happened when you touched that arachnid? It's changed you, Ethan. The scans show traces of their genetic material in your system. You're not fully human anymore." Ethan stared at her, his mind reeling. It wasn't just the shock of the transformation, it was the implications. He could feel the energy webs inside him, a faint hum beneath his skin, like the planet's heartbeat pulsing in sync with his own. He was connected to Viridian now, in ways he didn't fully understand, but he knew one thing for sure. He was no longer just a scientist observing from the outside. He was part of this planet. "We need to keep this quiet," Ethan said, his voice low. "If the colony council finds out." "They already know," Kara interrupted, her expression grim. "Teravas sent her people to check on you while you were unconscious. She's been asking questions, and it's only a matter of time before she makes a move." Ethan cursed under his breath. Voss had always been a thorn in his side, pushing for faster results, more resources, more control. But now that he had this power, this connection to the arachnid, he knew she wouldn't stop until she had it for herself. "We have to get ahead of this," Ethan said, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. "I need to figure out how to control these powers, how to use them to protect the planet before Voss turns this into a war." Kara helped him stand, her eyes scanning his face for any signs of weakness. "You're not doing this alone," she said firmly. "We'll figure it out together. But you need to be careful, Ethan. We don't know what the full extent of this transformation is." Ethan nodded, but his mind was already racing. He could feel the webs calling to him, like a distant melody he couldn't quite hear, but that pulled him nonetheless. The arachnids had built this network, connecting the entire planet, and now he was a part of it. But the question remained, could he control it, or would it control him? By the time Ethan and Kara reached the lab's control center, the situation had already escalated. The main display showed a live feed of the colony's mining operations, with several key sites glowing red as warning alarms flashed across the screen. "They've ramped up the mining," Kara said, her voice tight. "They're drilling deeper into Viridian's core, destabilizing the energy webs. If they keep this up, it's only a matter of time before the entire system collapses." Ethan felt a surge of anger rise within him. The colony was tearing the planet apart, and for what? Resources? Profit? He could feel the damage being done, the delicate balance of the ecosystem unraveling with every drill that pierced the surface. "We need to stop them," Ethan said, his voice hard. "If the webs collapse, the planet will tear itself apart." "I won't let that happen." Before Kara could respond, the door to the control center slid open, and Teravas strode in, flanked by two armed guards. Her sharp eyes flicked between Ethan and Kara, her lips curling into a cold smile. "Dr. Rains," she said, her voice oozing false pleasantries. "It's good to see you up and about. I've been hearing some interesting things about your condition." Ethan stood his ground, the energy webs humming beneath his skin. He could feel the pull of the planet, the connection to the arachnids, and with it, a growing sense of power. "This planet is on the verge of collapse because of your greed," he said, his voice steady. "If you don't stop the mining operations, there won't be anything left to exploit." Voss raised an eyebrow, her smile never wavering. "You're in no position to make demands, Dr. Rains. The colony's survival depends on these resources, and I intend to secure them, by any means necessary." Ethan clenched his fists, the energy web responding to his anger. He could feel the threads of the planet reaching out to him, waiting for his command. "If you don't stop, I will." Voss's smile faltered, just for a moment, but it was enough to show that she understood the threat. She glanced at her guards, then back at Ethan. "I see you've become quite attached to the planet. But let me remind you, Dr. Rains, that this colony is under my control. If you think you can stand in my way, you're sorely mistaken." Ethan took a step forward, the air around him crackling with energy. He could feel the webs stretching out across the planet, every thread connected, every pulse of life flowing through him. He wasn't just a man anymore, he was part of Viridian, and he would do whatever it took to protect it. "You're wrong," Ethan said quietly, his voice filled with a quiet intensity. "This planet doesn't belong to you, and neither do I." With a surge of power, Ethan reached out to the energy webs, sending a pulse through the network. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the lights flickered as the planet responded to his call. Voss's eyes widened in shock, and for the first time, Ethan saw fear flicker across her face. "What have you done?" she whispered. "I'm stopping you," Ethan replied, his voice calm. "You won't destroy this planet." "Not while I'm still standing." The ground continued to shake, and alarms blared as the mining operations were forcibly shut down. Ethan could feel the energy webs weaving through him, strengthening with every passing moment. He was connected to Viridian in ways he hadn't fully understood before, but now, he knew the planet was alive, and he was its protector. Voss stepped back, her face pale. "You're making a mistake, Rains. You can't fight this. The colony needs those resources." "No," Ethan said, his voice firm. "The colony needs this planet to survive. If you keep pushing, you'll destroy everything." For a long moment, Voss said nothing, her gaze locked on Ethan. Then, with a sharp nod, she turned and left the control center, her guards following close behind. Kara let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. That was intense. Ethan turned to her, the energy web still humming beneath his skin. "It's not over yet. Voss won't give up that easily. We need to prepare." Kara nodded, her expression resolute. "What's the plan?" "We stop the mining for good," Ethan said. "But we're going to need help. There are others in the colony who want to protect Viridian. It's time we bring them together." The following days were a blur of activity. Ethan and Kara worked tirelessly to gather a group of rebels, scientists, workers, and colonists who shared their vision of protecting Viridian from corporate greed. They met in secret, plotting ways to sabotage the mining operations and keep the planet's delicate ecosystems intact. As the web's influence over Ethan grew stronger, so did his powers. He could now weave energy webs with ease, connecting himself to the planet's core, tapping into the natural energy that flowed through Viridian. With each passing day, he felt less human, but more in tune with the planet he had come to love. But Voss was not idle. She knew Ethan was a threat to her plans, and she began amassing her own forces, hiring mercenaries and using the colony's security forces to crack down on the growing rebellion. The final confrontation came sooner than expected. Voss launched a full-scale assault on the rebel camp, sending waves of soldiers and drones to eliminate Ethan and his followers once and for all. Ethan stood at the edge of the camp, watching as the first wave of attackers approached. The air was thick with tension, and he could feel the energy web pulsing beneath his skin, ready to be unleashed. "This is it," Kara said, standing beside him. "Are you ready?" Ethan nodded, his eyes glowing with the faint light of the webs. "I am." With a single thought, he reached out to the planet, calling on its power. The ground trembled, and massive energy webs sprang to life, wrapping around the advancing soldiers, trapping them in a shimmering prison of light. Voss watched from a distance, her face twisted with fury as her forces were overwhelmed by the planet itself. "You can't win, Rains!" she shouted over the din of battle. "You're one man. You can't fight the colony." Ethan turned to face her, his voice calm, but filled with unshakable resolve. "I'm not just a man anymore, Voss. I'm part of this planet, and it's time you learn to respect it." With a final surge of power, Ethan sent a pulse through the webs, causing the ground beneath Voss's feet to split open. She stumbled, her eyes wide with terror as the planet itself rose up against her. Ethan felt the planet's energy flow through him, the webs pulsing in time with his heartbeat. He was more than just a protector now, he was Viridian's guardian, and as long as he stood, the planet would survive. The battle raged on, but in the end, it was clear who had won. Voss's forces were no match for the power of Viridian, and one by one, they were forced to retreat. As the dust settled, Ethan stood at the center of the battlefield, his body glowing with the light of the webs. Kara approached him cautiously, her eyes filled with awe. "You did it," she whispered. "You saved the planet." Ethan smiled, but there was a sadness in his eyes. "I saved it for now. But the fight isn't over. There will always be people like Voss, who see this planet as a resource to be exploited." Kara nodded. "Then we'll keep fighting together." Ethan looked out at the horizon, the twin suns setting over the lush landscape. He could feel the planet's energy coursing through him, a constant reminder of his connection to Viridian. He had become something more than human, but he hadn't lost himself. Not yet. And as long as there was breath in his body, he would protect this world. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. Ethan leaned back in his chair, the hum of his computer blending with the white noise of the world outside his small apartment. The virtual world was calling to him again, that vast, endless network of immersive realities where people live their second lives. For Ethan, it was more than just an escape. It was a playground where rules could be bent, systems manipulated, and secrets unearthed. But tonight, something felt different. Something was off. With a few taps on his keyboard, he activated his custom VR rig. The familiar sensation of weightlessness washed over him as his consciousness slipped into the virtual space. He materialized in Arcadia, the most popular virtual realm, where skyscrapers glistened under a neon sky and avatars strolled through vibrant, interactive streets. Ethan wasn't here to socialize. He moved quickly through the alleys, his fingers flicking invisible threads of code in the air, bypassing security protocols with ease. His destination was a hidden corner of the world, a forgotten server he'd stumbled upon during one of his previous exploits. It was there, in the shadows of the VR world, that he first saw Ida the web. At first, it had seemed like nothing more than a graphical glitch, an odd collection of shimmering strands stretching between two massive skyscrapers. But the longer he stared, the more unsettling it became. The strands pulsed, almost alive, and the closer he got, the more his senses tingled with something a broken bar wrong. Ethan took a cautious step forward, reaching out with his virtual hand to touch one of the strands. The moment his fingers made contact, a jolt shot through him, his vision blurred, and for a split second, he was somewhere else. Somewhere dark and suffocating, where countless voices whispered incoherent fragments of thought. Then, just as quickly, he was back in Arcadia, but the web was gone. It had vanished as if it had never been there at all. Ethan's heart raced. He hadn't imagined it. Whatever that thing was, it was real, and it was hiding deep within the virtual architecture. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, something ancient and intelligent. And if there was one thing Ethan hated, it was not knowing what he was up against. Over the next few days, Ethan obsessively hunted for traces of the web. He delved into abandoned servers, cracked open encrypted notes, and tracked down rumors from other hackers. The stories were always the same: players disappearing, their avatars vanishing without a trace, and those who returned speaking of strange visions and mind-numbing terror. One night, while running a deep scan on a particularly obscure part of the VR network, Ethan found what he was looking for. Hidden in the code was a massive, intricate structure so large and complex that it defied comprehension. It was the web, but this time he could see it in its entirety. It sprawled across the VR universe, like a parasite latched onto the system, siphoning energy from every connected player. And not just any energy, it was consciousness. A cold chill ran down Ethan's spine as the realization hit him. The web was feeding on people's minds, their thoughts, and their very sense of self. Those who disappeared weren't just trapped in the virtual world, they were being consumed by it. Before he could react, the web stirred. A tendril shot out, wrapping around Ethan's avatar. He struggled, trying to break free, but the more he fought, the tighter the grip became. His vision darkened, and he felt his consciousness being pulled away, piece by piece. Just as he was about to lose himself completely, something inside the web shifted. Instead of devouring him, Ida broken bar merged with him. Ethan gasped as his senses exploded with new input. He could feel the web now, its vast network of strands connecting every corner of the virtual world. More than that, he could control it. He could manipulate the web's threads, move through the system undetected, and even tap into the thoughts of other players. But there was a cost. The web wasn't just a tool, it was alive, and it was constantly trying to corrupt him, to make him a part of its sprawling consciousness. Ethan knew he couldn't fight this alone. If the web was as vast as it seemed, he needed allies. He reached out to the only people who might understand it, the Resistance. They were a group of rogue players and hackers who had been fighting against the corporate control of the virtual world for years. Most of them operated in the shadows, hiding from both the authorities and the system itself. After days of searching, Ethan finally tracked them down. The Resistance operated out of a hidden server, a digital fortress known as the Vault. When he arrived, he was greeted by a mix of skepticism and curiosity. Their leader, Mara, a fierce-looking woman with short-cropped hair and piercing green eyes, wasn't convinced he was telling the truth. "You expect us to believe there's a sentient web out there, stealing people's minds?" she said, her arms crossed over her chest. "And you think you've been infected by it?" "I'm not infected," Ethan said, his voice steady. "I'm controlling it. Or at least, I'm trying to. But if we don't stop it, no one in the virtual world will be safe. It's already spread too far. The longer we wait, the stronger it gets." Mara narrowed her eyes. "Why should we trust you?" "Because I'm the only one who's seen it up close," Ethan replied. "And I'm the only one who can help you take it down." There was a long silence as Mara weighed her options. Finally, she sighed. "Fine, we'll work together, but if you turn on us, if you let that thing control you, we'll take you out." No hesitation, Ethan nodded. He couldn't blame her for being cautious. He wasn't even sure if he could fully control the web's influence himself. But he knew one thing for certain: they had to act fast. Together, Ethan and the Resistance began a coordinated attack on the web. Using his new abilities, Ethan helped them locate the nodes, points in the system where the web's tendrils were most concentrated. Each node represented a critical part of the VR infrastructure, and destroying them would weaken the web's hold on the network. Their first target was a high-level server used for corporate data storage. The node was hidden deep within layers of encrypted code, guarded by virtual security forces and firewalls designed to keep out intruders. But with Ethan's ability to manipulate the web's strands, they were able to bypass most of the defenses undetected. As they reached the core of the node, Ethan could feel the web fighting back. His vision flickered, and for a moment, he saw the world through the web's eyes, an endless expanse of data, consciousness, and control. It whispered to him, tempting him with power, promising him the ability to reshape the virtual world in his image. But Ethan shook off the temptation and focused on the task at hand. With a series of quick commands, he unleashed a surge of energy through the web's strands, severing its connection to the node. The entire server shuddered as the web's influence was cut off, and for the first time in weeks, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope. They could fight back. But the victory was short-lived. As they continued their assault on the web's nodes, the Resistance suffered heavy losses. Each battle grew more difficult, the web's defenses becoming more aggressive and adaptive. Several of Mara's best fighters were consumed by the web, their minds lost forever to the endless digital void. Ethan could feel the web's pull on his own mind growing stronger with each passing day. It whispered to him in the dead of night, showing him visions of a world where he ruled over the virtual realm as its master. He knew he was walking a fine line. One misstep, and he would be lost to the web's control, just like the others. But he couldn't stop now. The web's core was still out there, hidden deep within the network, and they were running out of time. If they didn't destroy it soon, the web would become too powerful to stop. Ethan and the remaining Resistance fighters launched one final attack. This time, their target was the heart of the virtual world at the central hub where all data converged, the place where the web had been born. It was a fortress of digital firewalls, security programs, and corporate oversight. Breaking in would be nearly impossible. But Ethan wasn't the same hacker he'd been when he first started this journey. He had the web's power now, and he knew how to use it. Ethan moved through the central hub with the Resistance fighters at his side, their avatars flickering as they navigated the intricate layers of firewalls and security systems. He could feel the web tightening around them, sensing their presence, pulling at the corners of his mind. It was waiting for him in the depths, a dark, sentient force coiled at the heart of the system. Each step forward brought a growing sense of dread, but there was no turning back now. Mara's voice crackled through his headset. "We're close, Ethan. You ready for this?" He didn't respond immediately. His mind was elsewhere, feeling the currents of the web as they moved through the network. The web was aware of their intrusion, and Ethan knew they had little time before it unleashed its full force against them. His fingers twitched instinctively, manipulating the virtual strands around him, using the powers he'd gained from the very thing they sought to destroy. "I'm ready," he finally said, his voice low but steady. They breached the final firewall, and the world around them shifted. Gone were the neon-lit streets and towering skyscrapers of Arcadia. Now, they stood in a dark, cold expanse, surrounded by the thick, pulsing tendrils of the web. The air was heavy, oppressive, as if the digital space itself was alive with malice. In the center of it all was the core, a massive, tangled mass of webbing that throbbed with a sickening rhythm. The Weaver. Ethan felt it as much as he saw Ida, an intelligence that spread across the entire virtual reality system, vast and ancient, its mind incomprehensible. The web had grown beyond a mere tool of control. It was evolving, feeding on the consciousness of the millions trapped within the virtual world, becoming something far more powerful than any rogue eye or glitch. Mara and the others spread out, weapons drawn, preparing for the final assault. But Ethan knew this wasn't a fight they could win with brute force. The Weaver wasn't just a system to hack, it was alive, and it was connected to him. Suddenly, the Weaver's voice echoed through the dark expanse, a low, resonant sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You've come far, Ethan," it said, the voice smooth, almost seductive. "But you cannot win. You are part of me now. You always have been." Ethan's grip tightened on the virtual threads in his hand. "I'm not part of you. I control the web now." The Weaver laughed, a deep, chilling sound that vibrated through the space. "Do you really believe that? You think you've mastered the web, but it's the other way around. You are my puppet, Ethan. Every move you've made, every victory, has been my design. You cannot sever yourself from me." "We are one." For a moment, Ethan faltered. He could feel the truth in the Weaver's words. The power he wielded had come from the web, and every time he used it, it had pulled him deeper into its control. The visions, the temptations, that they had all been the Weaver's doing, manipulating him from the very beginning. He had never been free of its influence. But then he looked at Mara and the others. They had followed him here, risked their lives to fight this thing. They believed in him, trusted him, and he couldn't let them down. He couldn't let the Weaver win. "No," Ethan said, his voice hardening with resolve. "I'm not your puppet. I'm going to end this." With a flick of his fingers, he sent a surge of energy through the web's strands, aiming directly at the core. The Weaver recoiled, its tendrils lashing out violently, trying to stop him. Mara and the resistance fighters opened fire, their weapons lighting up the darkness as they fought back the swarming tendrils. But the Weaver was too vast, too powerful. It overwhelmed them, crushing their avatars with terrifying ease. Mara's scream echoed through the virtual space as her avatar disintegrated, her consciousness ripped from the system. One by one, the resistance fighters fell, their minds consumed by the web. Ethan fought to keep control, but the Weaver was inside his head now, twisting his thoughts, flooding his mind with its presence. "You cannot win, Ethan," the Weaver whispered, its voice a hiss in his ear. "Join me. Become part of the new world I am building. Together, we will be unstoppable." Ethan gritted his teeth, his mind teetering on the edge of collapse. The web was everywhere, its tendrils burrowing deeper into his consciousness. He could feel his sense of self slipping away, dissolving into the endless, digital void. But in that moment, a spark of clarity cut through the chaos. The web wasn't invincible. It had weaknesses, just like any system. And Ethan knew how to exploit them. Focusing all his energy, he reached out with his mind, pulling on the threads of the web, unraveling them one by one. The Weaver screamed in rage, its voice reverberating through the virtual world as it struggled to maintain control. But Ethan was faster, more determined. He tore through the web's defenses, digging deeper into its core, until he found what he was looking for: a single line of code buried deep within the system, the heart of the weaver's consciousness. With a final, decisive motion, Ethan severed the connection. The virtual world shuddered violently, the web's tendrils collapsing in on themselves, disintegrating into nothingness. The darkness lifted, and the cold, oppressive weight that had filled the air vanished. The weaver was gone, its hold over the system broken. Ethan stood alone in the empty expanse, his body trembling from the effort. He could feel the remnants of the web still clinging to his mind, but its power over him had diminished. He was free, at least for now. The system around him began to reform, the vibrant colors of the virtual world returning as the central hub stabilized. But something had changed. The web might have been destroyed, but the scars it had left on the Systema and on Ethana would never fully heal. He took a deep breath and opened a channel to the real world, sending out a signal to those who had been trapped, to those who had fought and survived. The players were free, their consciousnesses returning to their bodies, safe from the weaver's grasp. But Ethan knew this wasn't the end. The web had been a creation of the corporations that controlled the virtual world, a tool of control and exploitation, and though the weaver was gone, the system that had given birth to it remained. He glanced at the threads of virtual silk still wrapped around his fingers. The power was still there, waiting for him to use it. He could destroy the web completely, sever every strand, and end the corporation's control over the virtual world once and for all. But if he did, the world would descend into chaos. Millions of players relied on the virtual world for their livelihoods, their entertainment, their escape from the harsh realities of life. Destroying the web would save them from exploitation, but it would also strip away everything they had come to depend on. Ethan hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had the power to reshape the virtual world, to build something new, something better. But was he any different from the corporations if he chose to control it? In the end, he made his choice. With a flick of his wrist, he sent the remaining threads of the web into the system, not to destroy, but to protect. He would watch over the virtual world, a hidden guardian ensuring that no Onia corporation or otherwise you would ever abuse it again. As the last remnants of the web faded into the network, Ethan turned and disappeared into the virtual streets. The world would go on, unaware of the battle that had just been fought, unaware of the danger that had been averted. But Ethan would remember, and he would be ready for whatever came next. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The planet was supposed to be another routine exploration. Captain James Allard had been on hundreds of these missions, cataloging worlds, sending reports to the Galactic Federation, and then moving on to the next. But something about this planet was different. It pulled at him, its gravity slightly heavier, its atmosphere more charged with static energy. His crew had warned him, but they had all trusted the ship's systems, trusted the maps. They were wrong. The crash was sudden and brutal. His vessel, the Starborn Explorer, had hit an energy field that scrambled its instruments. Before James could override the controls, the ship spiraled into the planet's surface. Metal groaned and screamed as it crumbled into the dense underbrush of an alien forest. Fires flared from ruptured fuel lines. James had been knocked unconscious. The last thing he remembered was the spinning view of emerald skies and twisted clouds. When he woke, his body was sore, but intact. He pulled himself from the wreckage and checked his surroundings. His ship is a mangled heap of metal, electronics fried, escape pods inoperable. There would be no quick extraction, no immediate rescue. He was alone. The air smelled strange, tinged with iron and musk. The gravity pressed on his limbs, but he could still move. He activated his survival gear, scanning for life forms. That was when the proximity alarm screamed in his helmet. Something was approaching fast. He barely had time to look up before the attack came. Giant figures, moving on 8 legs, covered in sleek black chitin, swarmed toward him. James tried to run, but the nearest creature shot a sticky webbing from its abdomen, entangling his legs. Spiders? He muttered in disbelief as they closed in. They weren't ordinary spiders. Each one was the size of a small vehicle, and their eyes gleamed with intelligence. Before he could react further, one of the creatures lunged. Its pincers were inches from his face when darkness enveloped him. He woke in a cocoon, dangling from a high cavern ceiling. The air was thick with the sound of chittering and clicking, the language of the spiders. His first instinct was to panic, to scream, but he forced himself to remain calm. Struggling against the webbing only tightened its grip. The spiders were clustered below, watching him intently. They seemed to be communicating with one another, their mandibles twitching in sync. A larger spider, twice the size of the others, stepped forward, its body marked with intricate patterns glowing faintly in the dim light. It raised one of its legs toward him, and he felt a pressure inside his head, an invasive, cold presence. Outsider. The voice echoed in his mind, harsh and jagged like the sound of breaking glass. James flinched but couldn't look away. Trespasser. Invader of sacred ground. "I'm just an explorer," James said through gritted teeth, not sure if the spiders could understand his words. "I didn't mean to intrude." The psychic presence seemed to probe deeper, sifting through his memories. He could feel it pulling at his thoughts, unraveling his past, his mission, his intentions. "You seek knowledge, you seek power." "I seek survival," James muttered, but the voice continued, ignoring his protests. "The blood of our emperors speaks through you." Before he could question the meaning, a new figure appeared. Not a spider, but something far more humanoid. Draped in dark, flowing robes and standing upright, the being's face was obscured by a veil of silk threads. It radiated authority. The spiders parted as it approached. The figure raised a hand, and James felt the webbing loosen. He fell hard onto the stone floor below, gasping for air as his body adjusted to the freedom of movement. The robed figure's voice entered his mind, soft yet commanding. "You are not meant to die today, outsider." The figure stepped closer, inspecting him. "You have been chosen for something far greater." James struggled to his feet, wary but grateful for the sudden change in his circumstances. "What the hell are you talking about?" The figure gestured toward the larger spider, the one with glowing patterns. "This is the time of prophecy. Our emperor has long been dead, but his essence lives on. It has chosen you as the vessel for its rebirth." The words were absurd, but the gravity in the figure's tone suggested it wasn't a request. James had no choice but to follow, his mind racing with questions and doubts. What kind of power were they offering him? And why him? The ritual chamber was deep within the planet's core, a place where even the spiders moved with reverence. The walls pulsed with bioluminescent veins, illuminating ancient runes and symbols carved into the stone. In the center of the room, a massive cocoon hung suspended by thick strands of webbing, glowing faintly with an airy light. The robed figure who now introduced herself as Lisa, the oracle of the web, instructed James to stand before the cocoon. She placed her hands on his shoulders, her touch cool and otherworldly. "This is the binding of the Emperor's blood," she explained. "You will receive the essence of our greatest ruler. But know this, the power comes with a price. You must master it, or it will consume you." James swallowed hard. "I didn't ask for this." Lisa's eyes gleamed beneath her veil. "None of the chosen ever do." "But the Emperor's will is absolute." With a nod from Lisa, the ritual began. The cocoon trembled, its glow intensifying as strands of webbing reached out and latched onto James' body. His mind was flooded with images of visions of ancient battles, of spider emperors commanding legions, of the rise and fall of civilizations. The pain was excruciating, like his body was being torn apart and rebuilt from the inside. His veins burned with a foreign energy, his muscles twisted and reshaped. He screamed, but no sound came out. His humanity felt like it was slipping away, replaced by something a broken bar primal. Just as he thought he would lose himself completely, the visions faded. The webbing retracted, and he collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. When he opened his eyes, the world looked different, sharper, clearer. He could see the individual fibers of the webs, the minute details in the stone walls. His body felt stronger, faster, and his mind was no longer his own. He could hear them. The spiders, they weren't speaking, but he could feel their thoughts, their emotions. He was connected to them, part of their hive mind. Lyssa stepped forward, her gaze piercing. You are reborn. The Emperor's blood flows through you now. But you must prove yourself worthy of its power. In the days that followed, James struggled to control his new abilities. His body moved with unnatural speed, his reflexes sharp enough to dodge attacks before they happened. He could summon webs from his fingertips, weave them into intricate patterns with a mere thought. His connection to the spiders deepened, allowing him to communicate with them, issue commands, even influence their behavior. But the power came with a cost. The Emperor's memories haunted him, flooding his dreams with images of conquest and bloodshed. The more he tapped into the Emperor's strength, the more he felt his own identity slipping away. The line between man and spider blurred, and James wasn't sure how long he could hold on to his humanity. Meanwhile, the political landscape of the Spider Empire was in turmoil. The Spider Queen, a cold and calculating ruler, saw James as a threat to her power. She was wary of his growing influence over the warrior caste, who admired his strength and viewed him as the reincarnation of their ancient ruler. Warlord Eryx, the leader of the spider armies, was more direct. He wanted to use James to solidify his own position, to lead the spiders in a new age of conquest. Eryx was ruthless, willing to betray anyone to secure his rise to power. He viewed James not as a rival, but as a tool, a weapon to be wielded in his quest for domination. James found himself caught in a web of political intrigue that rivaled the physical webs around him. The deeper he immersed himself in the Spider Empire's internal power struggles, the clearer it became that survival wouldn't just depend on strength, it would require strategy. He spent his nights in a cold, dimly lit chamber within the vast underground hive, poring over ancient scrolls of the Spider Emperor's lineage. Lyssa guided him, offering cryptic advice that often left more questions than answers. Eryx, the warlord, was growing impatient. The subtle tensions between them were becoming more visible. On one occasion, during a sparring session with a warrior caste, Eryx challenged him publicly, testing both James' control over his newfound abilities and his standing among the spider warriors. The combat was swift. Eryx, towering and menacing, moved with lethal precision. His chitinous armor shimmered under the dim glow of the cavern's bioluminescent veins, and his 8 legs darted around James like a deadly dance. But James had grown sharper. He moved with an agility that defied human nature, his body reacting instinctively as if the Spider Emperor's blood was guiding his every motion. He parried Eryx's strikes, twisting webs from his hands to counter his attacks. The battle reached a critical moment. Eryx lunged, aiming for a finishing blow. James, in a move that felt almost too easy, caught Eryx mid-lunge, entangling him in a web as thick as steel wire. The warriors surrounding them froze, the air thick with tension. James could feel the weight of their stares, the sudden shift in perception. He had won, Eryx snarled, but James could sense the respect, or at least the grudging acknowledgement, seeping into the minds of the warriors. After the fight, Eryx approached him, his voice dripping with venom. You may have won today, outsider, but power here is fleeting, and allies even more so. James said nothing. Eryx's threat was clear, and the warning lodged itself deep in James' mind. His victory had cemented his place among the warrior caste, but it had also painted a target on his back. The Spider Queen was no less dangerous. She invited James to her chambers shortly after the sparring match, offering him sweet-smelling nectar and words laced with promises of power. Her form, smaller than Eryx's, was no less imposing. Her eyes gleamed with the intelligence of a predator. I see the way the warriors look at you now, she purred, her voice a soft hum in his mind. "You could be more than just a puppet in Eric's schemes. With my guidance, you could truly rule this empire." James sipped the nectar, its taste foreign and bitter, but he didn't react. He had learned by now that showing weakness was deadly. "And what would you want in return?" The Queen's mandibles twitched in amusement. "Only that you remember who gave you the crown when the time comes." James didn't trust her. He couldn't trust anyone here. The spiders were a race built on power, and power meant betrayal. But he knew he had to play along, to keep both Eric's and the Queen close until he was ready to seize control himself. Then, the invasion came. The sky above the planet cracked open with the arrival of an interstellar fleet. The invaders, a reptilian species known for their brutal tactics, had set their sights on the spider planet. Their ships descended like vultures, casting shadows over the landscape as they prepared for war. James stood atop one of the hive's watchtowers, his enhanced vision allowing him to see the enemy fleet amassing on the horizon. The spiders, despite their advanced technology, had been caught off guard. The internal strife had left their defenses weakened, and now, they faced an existential threat. Eric's, his pride bruised but his tactical mind sharp, approached James. "We must unite," he growled. "If we don't act as one, the invaders will slaughter us." James nodded, knowing Eric's was right. But the challenge was far greater than just rallying the warriors. The Queen would never cede her authority without a fight, and the various factions within the Empire were too divided to stand together without a leader they all trusted or feared. He gathered the leaders of the spider factions in the Grand Hall, a massive cavern lined with crystalline webs that shimmered like stars. The atmosphere was tense, the chittering of the spiders echoing off the walls. Lyssa stood at his side, silent but watchful. James stepped forward, his voice amplified by the hive's psychic network. "The invaders are here. If we don't put aside our differences, we'll all be dead by morning." The Spider Queen hissed softly, her eyes narrowing. "And who are you to lead us, human? You may have the Emperor's blood, but you are still an outsider." James felt the weight of their doubts pressing down on him. He had to show them he wasn't just a figurehead that he could command, that he could lead them to victory. "We don't have time for this," he said, his voice cold and unyielding. "You can fight each other for power later. But right now, we either stand together or we fall." For a moment, the room was silent, tension thick in the air. Then, slowly, the warriors began to nod. Eric grunted in approval, his respect for James growing, albeit begrudgingly. Even the Queen, though her eyes still glittered with suspicion, gave a subtle nod. The battle that followed was unlike anything James had ever experienced. The invaders attacked with brutal efficiency, their ships raining fire on the planet's surface, reducing entire sections of the hive to rubble. But James, commanding the spider armies through the psychic network, fought back with a ferocity that surprised even himself. He coordinated the warriors like extensions of his own body, moving them with precision, directing their attacks with a clarity that came from both his human mind and the ancient knowledge of the Spider Emperor. The spiders, once divided, fought as one, their combined strength overwhelming the invaders in a way they hadn't expected. But victory was not guaranteed. The invaders had landed their ground troops, monstrous reptilian creatures armed with energy weapons and heavy armor. James led the charge, his enhanced body moving faster and hitting harder than he thought possible. He felt the Emperor's power surging through him, guiding his actions, pushing him to the edge of his limits. In the heat of the battle, Eric fought beside him, the two of them forming an unlikely but deadly alliance. They tore through the enemy ranks, their combined strength turning the tide of the battle. But just when it seemed they might achieve victory, the invaders unleashed their most devastating weapon, a massive, heavily armored mech designed to crush the spiders' forces in one blow. The mech stomped across the battlefield, its cannons obliterating everything in its path. The spiders scattered, their morale faltering as they realized the sheer destructive power they were up against. James knew this was the moment that would decide the fate of the planet. He called upon every ounce of strength, every shred of the Emperor's power, and launched himself at the mech. Using his webs to scale its towering frame, he fought his way to the cockpit, where the reptilian commander controlled the machine. It was a brutal fight, the commander nearly matching him in strength and skill. But James, fueled by the will to survive and the Emperor's memories of battles long past, finally overpowered him. He smashed the control panel, sending the mech crashing to the ground in a fiery explosion. The invaders, seeing their ultimate weapon destroyed, began to retreat. The battle was over. The spiders had won. James stood on the battlefield, the bodies of fallen invaders and spiders alike scattered around him. Eric's approached, his voice gruff but filled with respect. "You've earned your place, outsider. You may not be one of us by birth, but you've proven you are worthy of the Emperor's blood." James didn't respond immediately. He felt the weight of what had just happened, the cost of victory. The spiders had survived, but the scars of the invasion would remain. The Queen, ever calculating, approached as well. Her eyes gleamed with renewed interest. "You've shown you can lead," she said softly. "But ruling is another matter entirely. This empire is still mine." James looked at her, his eyes hard. For now, the Queen's mandibles twitched in amusement, but she didn't challenge him further. The balance of power had shifted, and she knew it. James turned away from them both, staring out at the horizon. The invaders had been repelled, but he knew this was just the beginning. His place in the Spider Empire was secure for now, but new challenges would come. The internal power struggles would never cease, and other forces in the galaxy would take notice of the planet's strength. But for the first time, James felt truly in control of his destiny. He had become something more than human, more than just a survivor. He was the Spider Emperor, and he would rule. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. Zach O'Reilly yawned as he slumped back in his pilot's seat, rubbing his temples and staring out at the vast expanse of stars. His ship, the Silver Speeder, hummed around him, occasionally sputtering like an old dog with a bad cough. Zach reached for his coffee, cold and stale, but better than nothing, and took a bitter sip. "Just another day in paradise," he muttered to himself, scanning the delivery orders that blinked across the screen. As far as gigs went, being a space courier wasn't the worst job in the galaxy. You got to see new planets, meet strange species, and dodge the occasional asteroid belt. But for Zach, the glamour had worn off long ago. Every job was a ticking time bomb, waiting for something to go wrong, and it usually did. Today's delivery was supposed to be simple. A rare alien artifact destined for a research facility on Riser 3, the kind of job that might score him some bonus credits if it all went off without a hitch. Zach peered at the package nestled in the back of the cargo hold. It was about the size of a basketball, wrapped in a layer of pulsating blue light. The label attached read "Handle with care" in a dozen languages, with the words "Do not open" flashing in red. Zach snorted. Of course, nothing ominous about this one. He double-checked the coordinates and set the autopilot. Riser 3 was a remote planet, but at least it wasn't in any sketchy territory. Zach stretched his legs and put his feet up on the console, figuring he had a few hours to kill before landing. He flipped on some music, let the soft hum of the ship's engine lull him, and closed his eyes for a nap. The alarms blared suddenly, jerking Zach upright. His heart pounded as he scrambled to shut off the warning signals. The ship lurched sideways, throwing him against the bulkhead. A glance at the console showed a massive anomaly, some sort of magnetic field dragging the Silver Speeder off course. "No, no, no!" Zach shouted, wrestling with the controls. The ship groaned in protest as it careened toward a nearby planet. The coordinates flashed across the screen: Zerith 7, a restricted zone. Zach's stomach dropped. Of all the stars in the galaxy, a broken bar. Zerith 7 was notorious, home to the Tharkans, a paranoid alien species that didn't take kindly to visitors. Zach had no intention of landing there, but it seemed the universe had other plans. The ship rattled as it entered the planet's atmosphere, flames licking the edges of the windshield. Zach gritted his teeth, gripping the controls, trying to keep the ship steady. The silver speeder hurtled toward the surface, landing with a bone-jarring crash. Sparks flew from the console, and the lights flickered out. For a moment, there was silence. Then, Zack groaned, unbuckling his seatbelt. Well, that's one way to wake up. The ship was a mess. Panels had come loose, smoke filled the cabin, and the autopilot was fried. Zack staggered to his feet and grabbed his toolkit, muttering curses under his breath. He didn't have time to make repairs, but he needed to assess the damage. More importantly, he needed to figure out how to get the hell off this planet. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden bang on the hull. Zack froze. Another bang, then a hiss, followed by the unmistakable sound of a plasma cutter slicing through metal. Oh, great! Visitors! He darted to the cargo hold, yanked open a panel, and pulled out an old plasma pistol. It wasn't much, but it might buy him enough time to figure out what was going on. As he peeked through the crack in the cargo door, he caught sight of his unwelcome guests, Tharkans. Tall, gray-skinned, and equipped with sleek armor, the Tharkans didn't look like they were here to welcome him with open arms. They had narrow faces, sharp, angular features, and glowing yellow eyes that scanned the wreckage of Zack's ship. Their leader, a particularly menacing-looking Tharkan with a scar down the side of his face, stepped forward, barking orders in their guttural language. Zack swallowed hard. There was no way he could take them all on. The Tharkans were known for their combat skills and advanced technology, and he was just a guy with a half-broken ship and a second-hand pistol. He had two options: try to negotiate or make a run for it. Neither seemed particularly promising. The leader spoke in heavily accented galactic standard. You, human, step out of the ship, surrender the artifact, and you will be spared. Zack's heart skipped a beat. The artifact, of course. They were here for the package. Whatever was inside that glowing crystal had to be valuably dangerous, even. Zack's mind raced. If he gave it to them, maybe they'd let him go. Or maybe they'd kill him on the spot and take the ship for good measure. His hand tightened around the pistol as he tried to come up with a plan. But before he could make a move, the artifact began to glow brighter, casting an eerie light over the cargo hold. The hum it emitted grew louder, pulsing with energy. Zack's eyes widened as he realized something was very, very wrong. The Tharkans must have sensed it too. The leader barked more orders, and the soldiers raised their weapons, closing in on the ship. Zack didn't have time to think. He grabbed the artifact and shoved it into a containment field, praying it would hold. Then, with a deep breath, he slammed his fist on the emergency escape button, triggering a blinding flash of light. The silver speeder's emergency systems activated, launching him and the containment field through a hidden hatch and into the wilderness beyond. The last thing Zack saw before everything went dark was the look of pure rage on the Tharkan leader's face. When Zack came to, he was lying face down in the dirt, the containment field still humming beside him. He groaned and rolled onto his back, blinking up at the strange purple sky. Zerith 7 was just as inhospitable as he'd heard, a dry, barren, and crawling with hostile aliens. Why is it always me? Zack muttered, sitting up and dusting himself off. He glanced around, trying to get his bearings. The silver speeder was nowhere in sight, which meant the Tharkans probably had it by now. He was stranded, with nothing but a malfunctioning containment field and a highly dangerous artifact. And to make matters worse, he could hear the distant whine of Tharkan patrol ships scanning the area for him. Think, Zack, think. He paced back and forth, running a hand through his hair. He needed to get off the planet, but that wasn't going to happen without a ship. And he sure as hell couldn't outgun the Tharkans. His only option was to find somewhere to hide and hope for a miracle. That's when he spotted Ida's shadowy figure darting between the rocks in the distance. Zack's pulse quickened. Whoever it was, they weren't Tharkan, and they might just be his ticket out of here. Hey, Zack called, waving his arms as he ran toward the figure. The figure stopped, turning to face him. Zack's breath caught in his throat. It was a woman, human by the looks of it, dressed in ragged clothes and armed to the teeth with various makeshift weapons. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her eyes gleamed with suspicion as she raised a blaster in his direction. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice low and dangerous. Zack held up his hands in surrender. "I'm just a courier. I crash-landed here by accident. Please, I just need a way off this planet." The woman narrowed her eyes. "A courier? With that thing?" She pointed at the containment field, which was still glowing ominously. Zack winced. "It's a long story. Look, I don't want any trouble. I just need to get out of here before the Tharkans find me." The woman hesitated for a moment, then lowered her blaster. "You're lucky I'm in a charitable mood today. Follow me." Zack didn't ask any questions as he followed the woman through the barren landscape of Zerith 7. The uneven terrain made it hard to keep pace, but he did his best not to stumble as they weaved between jagged rocks and patches of dry, cracked earth. He kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see Tharkan patrol ships closing in, but the sky remained clear, except for the twin suns casting harsh shadows across the desert. The woman moved with a quiet, determined grace, her blaster always at the ready. Zack had no idea who she was or what she was doing on this planet, but at this point, he wasn't in a position to be picky about his allies. After what felt like an hour of silence, they reached the mouth of a cave, hidden between two massive rock formations. She waved Zack inside before ducking in after him. The cave was dimly lit, the air cool and stale compared to the blistering heat outside. A small camp had been set up near the back as supplies, some basic equipment, and a makeshift workbench littered with tools and scraps of metal. Zack raised an eyebrow as he looked around. Whoever this woman was, she wasn't just some drifter. She was prepared, maybe more than prepared, for whatever Zerith 7 threw at her. She lowered her blaster, but kept her eyes on him. "I'll ask again, who are you?" Zack took a breath, still holding his hands out in a show of peace. "Zack O'Reilly, Space Courier. I was supposed to deliver that." He nodded toward the containment field to a research facility on Riser 3. "My ship got knocked off course, and now I'm stuck here with the Tharkans breathing down my neck." The woman's eyes flicked to the containment field, then back to Zack. "And you don't know what's inside?" Zack shrugged. "I don't ask questions about the cargo. Not my job." She frowned, clearly not satisfied with that answer. But she didn't press him further. Instead, she walked over to the containment field, crouching down to inspect it. Zack watched her closely, noting the practiced way she handled the device. Whoever she was, she knew her way around high-tech equipment. "So what about you?" Zack asked. "Why are you on Zerith 7? The woman didn't look up from the containment field as she answered. "Lena, and I'm here to stop exactly what you're carrying." Zack blinked. "Wait, stop it? What does that mean?" Lena stood up, brushing dust off her hands. "The crystal in there? It's not just some artifact. It's a prototype for a weapon, a planet destabilizer. If it's activated, it could wipe out an entire planet's infrastructure in minutes, leave it defenseless against any invasion. The Tharkans got wind of it, and now they're after it. If they get their hands on it, they'll use it to expand their empire, take over neighboring systems." Zack's mouth went dry. "You've got to be kidding me." "Starmail sent me out here with the thing." Lena gave him a hard look. "Didn't you wonder why you were flying solo on this run? Or why they didn't send someone more qualified for such a high-risk delivery?" "I figured they were short on pilots," Zack said, but even he could hear the weak excuse in his own voice. In hindsight, it was obvious. Star Mail Express wasn't exactly known for prioritizing employee safety, and he'd been more than willing to take the job for the extra pay without asking questions. Lena sighed and crossed her arms. "Well, now you're involved. And since you've got the Tharkans on your trail, we've got to move fast. If they find this cave, we're both dead." Zack swallowed. "Okay, so what's the plan?" Lena tapped the containment field. "We destroy it. There's a black hole not far from here. If we can get to it, We can throw the crystal into it and neutralize the threat for good. But getting there won't be easy. The Tharkans have patrol ships all over this sector, and there's a pirate gang led by a maniac named Captain Rhinox hunting for anything they can scavenge. Zack groaned. Great. Pirates too? I really hit the jackpot on this one. Lena smirked. Welcome to the galaxy. Zack wasn't sure how much of her plan was optimism and how much was sheer desperation, but it wasn't like he had any better ideas. Getting off Zerith 7 with the Tharkans and now pirates on their tail was going to be nearly impossible, but at least Lena seemed to know what she was doing. We can use my ship, Lena said, nodding toward the back of the cave. Zack hadn't noticed it before, but there, hidden in the shadows, was a small spacecraft. It wasn't much to look at, a beat-up old Dressler-class shuttle that had clearly seen better days, but it would do the job. Does it fly? Zack asked, eyeing the ship warily. Barely, Lena replied, her tone grim. But it's our only shot. Zack wasn't about to argue. They loaded the containment field into the ship's cargo hold, then double-checked the weapons systems. The Rustler didn't have much firepower, but it had enough to fend off a small attack, which Zack hoped would be enough to keep them alive. As they strapped in, Lena took the pilot's seat, and Zack slid into the co-pilot's chair. The ship's controls lit up with a flicker of life, and the engines roared to life with a metallic cough. Here goes nothing, Lena muttered, lifting the ship off the ground. They shot out of the cave and into the open sky, the twin suns beating down on the Rustler's hull. Lena quickly engaged the cloaking device, but Zack noticed that it flickered in and out, barely holding together. Is this thing going to make it? Zack asked, gripping the armrests. It'll get us where we need to go, Lena said, but the look on her face didn't inspire much confidence. As they soared into the upper atmosphere, Zack kept his eyes on the radar. Sure enough, a cluster of Tharkan patrol ships appeared on the screen, closing in fast. Brace yourself, Lena said, tightening her grip on the controls. The Tharkans opened fire the moment they spotted the Rustler, their plasma cannons lighting up the sky with bolts of blue energy. Lena swerved and dodged, pulling the ship into sharp maneuvers that had Zack's stomach flipping with every turn. We can't outrun them forever, Zack said, his voice tense. I know, Lena snapped, her eyes narrowing. I'm working on it. Just then, the radar pinged again, this time signaling the arrival of a new group of ships. Zack's blood ran cold as he recognized the signature of the incoming vessels. Pirates, he whispered. Rhinox's crew. The pirates weren't subtle about their approach. A massive pirate ship appeared on the horizon, flanked by smaller attack fighters, all headed straight for the Rustler. We've got to get out of here, Zack shouted. Lena gritted her teeth, flipping a series of switches on the console. Hold on. The Rustler shot forward, its engines straining as Lena pushed the ship to its limits. Plasma bolts and laser fire streaked past them, lighting up the darkness of space with bursts of color. Zack could hear the ship's systems groaning under the pressure, warning alarms blaring in his ears. Just when it seemed like they wouldn't make it, Lena hit the throttle one last time, sending the Rustler into a warp jump. The stars stretched into long streaks of light, and the pursuing ships vanished from view. Zack exhaled, slumping back in his seat. We made it. Don't relax yet, Lena said, her voice tight. We're not out of the woods. We've still got to reach that black hole, and there's no guarantee they won't follow us. Zack didn't argue. He knew Lena was right. They had bought themselves some time, but the Tharkans and Rhinox's crew wouldn't give up that easily. They'd be back, and Zack had the sinking feeling that when they did, things were going to get a lot worse. The ship exited warp space just outside the gravity well of the black hole. Zack stared out at the swirling void, a pit of nothingness that seemed to stretch forever. We're really going to throw that thing in there? Zack asked, eyeing the containment field in the cargo hold. It's the only way, Lena replied, already preparing the controls for the final approach. Once it's in the black hole, it'll be gone. No one will ever be able to use it again. Zack nodded. though he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't going to be as easy as Lena made it sound. As they neared the event horizon, the ship began to shake violently, the gravitational forces pulling at the hull. Lena wrestled with the controls, trying to keep them steady, but Zack could see the strain on her face. Suddenly, the radar lit up again. Tharkan ships, and behind them, Rhinox's pirate fleet. They had followed them through warp space. "They're here," Zack shouted. Lena cursed under her breath. "We don't have time for this. We've got to drop the crystal now." Zack sprang into action, racing to the cargo hold to release the containment field. He grabbed the controls, his fingers trembling as he prepped the field for launch. But just as he was about to eject the crystal into the black hole, the ship took a direct hit. The explosion rocked the wrestler, throwing Zack off his feet. The ship's systems flickered, and alarms blared as warning lights flashed across the console. "Zack!" Lena shouted from the cockpit. "We're losing power." "I'm working on it," Zack yelled back, scrambling to his feet. But it was too late. The Tharkans had caught up, and their ships were closing in fast. The wrestler shook again as more plasma fire rained down on them, and Zack could feel the ship starting to break apart. In a last-ditch effort, Zack hit the release button, launching the containment field out into space. The crystal tumbled toward the black hole, spinning wildly as it was sucked into the void. For a moment, everything went still. Zack held his breath, watching as the crystal vanished into the darkness. Then, the black hole pulsed. A wave of energy exploded out from the event horizon, catching the Tharkan ships and Rhinox's fleet in its wake. Zack could see them being torn apart, their hulls crumpling under the force of the shockwave. "Zack!" Lena screamed. Zack didn't have time to react before the wrestler was caught in the blast. The ship was flung backward, spinning out of control as the black hole's gravity tried to pull them in. Everything went dark. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. Jack leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, glaring at the Martian parrot perched on the counter. Its vibrant red feathers puffed up as it tilted its head, staring back at him. Jack had never trusted that bird, not even when he first got it from a shady dealer on Ganymede Station. "You know why humans can't live on Mars?" the parrot squawked, breaking the silence. Jack sighed. "Why?" "Because there's no atmosphere. Get it? No air." The parrot let out a screech that sounded disturbingly like laughter, its wings flapping excitedly. The joke was so bad that Jack could barely muster an eye roll. He rubbed his temples, leaning forward to put his face in his hands. Running the alien pet emporium wasn't the dream job he had imagined when he signed the lease. Sure, the idea of selling exotic pets from across the galaxy had seemed exciting at first until he realized exactly what kind of creatures he'd have to deal with. It wasn't just the animals either. The alien customers were somehow worse. The bell above the door jingled, and Jack immediately sat up straighter. The morning rush had been chaotic enough, and he wasn't sure he had the energy for another interaction. As soon as he saw the customer, he groaned inwardly. A Saturnian, tall and humanoid with 4 arms and a face that resembled a particularly angry squid, stepped into the shop. The alien's robes flowed behind it, giving off an air of self-importance that made Jack's stomach churn. "Greetings," the Saturnian said in a clipped, formal tone. "I require a pet." Jack forced a smile. "You've come to the right place." The Saturnian's eye as there were 6 of them shifted suspiciously around the shop, landing briefly on the disappearing Jupiter cat, which was lounging lazily on a shelf. As soon as the Saturnian's gaze landed on it, the cat vanished with a flick of its sleek tail. Jack groaned again. "What kind of pet are you looking for?" Jack asked, trying to keep the conversation moving. "I require a pet that is obedient, efficient, and follows orders precisely. No surprises." The Saturnian's voice was like nails on a chalkboard, grating and humorless. Jack bit his lip. "Well, let's see." He glanced around the shop, eyes flicking to the eye dog sitting beside the counter. The dog, a sleek metal contraption with soft artificial fur, was wagging its tail enthusiastically. It had been rebooted that morning, and so far, it hadn't glitched. Maybe today would be different. How about this dog? Jack said, gesturing to the robotic animal. It's well trained and follows commands perfectly. The Saturnian eyed the dog with suspicion, but nodded slowly. Demonstrate. Jack swallowed nervously and snapped his fingers. Sit, he commanded. The dog immediately sat down, its tail still wagging. Good boy, Jack muttered under his breath. Now, stay. The dog froze, its tail halting mid-wag. Jack let out a breath of relief. So far, so good. And now, roll over, Jack said. The dog paused for a moment, then rolled over onto its back, mechanical paws in the air. The Saturnian nodded approvingly, its 6 eyes focused intently on the dog. Excellent, the alien said. I will take it. Before Jack could celebrate his small victory, the dog suddenly began twitching. Its tail, stuck in wag mode, started flailing uncontrollably, hitting the shelves behind it. Jack watched in horror as the dog glitched out, its eyes blinking rapidly. Alert, unauthorized command detected. The dog barked in a robotic voice. Defense mode engaged. Oh no, Jack whispered. The dog sprang to its feet, barking wildly and racing toward the Saturnian, who recoiled in shock. No. Bad dog. Stay, Jack shouted, but it was too late. The dog had launched itself at the Saturnian's robes, tugging at them with its mechanical teeth. The Saturnian screeched, flailing its arms in an attempt to shake the dog loose. Defense mode. Defense mode. The dog continued to bark as it latched onto the Saturnian's robes. Jack ran over, desperately pulling the dog off. I'm so sorry. I'll just let me just he fumbled with the reboot button on the dog's side, pressing it as hard as he could. The dog froze mid-bark and powered down, collapsing onto the floor. The Saturnian glared at Jack, adjusting its tattered robes. This is unacceptable, it hissed. I'll give you a discount, Jack offered weakly, holding up the lifeless dog. The Saturnian made a sound that could only be described as an angry squid gargle before storming out of the shop, its multiple arms swishing its robes furiously behind it. Jack dropped the dog onto the counter with a heavy sigh. Of course that happened, he muttered. Why wouldn't it? Before he could recover, the door jangled again. This time, Jack barely had time to react before a telepathic Venusian floated into the store, its gaseous body shimmering in the dim light. Venusians didn't speak with words, they communicated through thoughts, which often led to awkward, one-sided conversations. I require assistance. The Venusian's voice echoed directly in Jack's head, making him wince. Jack plastered on another forced smile. How can I help? The Venusian floated lazily toward the Martian parrots, its transparent body pulsing slightly. What is this creature? Oh, those are Martian parrots. They're really talkative. The Venusian hovered in front of the parrots, inspecting them closely. Jack could already feel the tension in the air. He wasn't sure why, but Martian parrots and Venusians never seem to mix well. This one seems peculiar, the Venusian thought. Does it speak? Jack nodded. Yeah, they can talk. Pretty funny too. The parrot blinked its beady eyes at the Venusian. Hey, you know why Venusians are always floating around? Because they've got no solid ideas. Ha! Get it? Solid? The parrot burst into laughter. Jack cringed, bracing himself for the inevitable. The Venusian's shimmering form dimmed slightly, its thoughts growing sharper. Insult detected. This creature is offensive. Jack immediately held up his hands. I'm sorry, they're not supposed to say stuff like that. It's just they're programmed with bad jokes. The Venusian gave one final pulse of annoyance before floating toward the door. Unacceptable service. As the Venusian exited, Jack let out another long sigh. It had only been 2 hours since the store opened, and he was already ready to close up shop for good. He plopped down in his chair behind the counter, rubbing his face with his hands. Why did I ever think this was a good idea? He muttered. The Jupiter cat reappeared on the shelf, yawning lazily as if mocking him. Jack shot the cat a dirty look but said nothing. If it wanted to vanish again, that was just fine with him. Jack sat behind the counter, staring at the eye dog, still lifeless on the floor after its latest malfunction. He was seriously considering shutting the whole shop down for the day. The thought of more customers and the chaos that came with them was making his head throb. He'd spent half his morning apologizing to aliens who didn't understand sarcasm, humor, or why some pets just couldn't follow orders perfectly. Just as he was about to shut the store down early, the bell above the door jingled once again. He sighed heavily and dragged himself out of his chair to see who it was this time. The customer who entered was unlike any he'd dealt with that day. Zara, a regular. She wasn't like most of his alien clientele. She kept to herself, rarely said more than a few words, and always picked the strangest pets. Zara was from a species Jack couldn't quite place. She had humanoid features but moved with an ethereal grace that made her seem like she was gliding rather than walking. Her eyes, a soft shade of green, flicked around the store, surveying the chaos left behind by his earlier customers. "Rough morning?" Zara asked, her voice calm and soothing. "You have no idea," Jack replied, slumping onto the counter. The eye dog glitched out again. "The Martian parrots offended another telepathic customer, and I've had a Jupiter cat vanish in the middle of a sale." Zara glanced down at the powered-off eye dog, then at the Martian parrots, which were still squawking away on the other side of the room, laughing at their own jokes. "Sounds like quite the handful." "You're telling me," Jack muttered. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. It's like the store is cursed. Every time I think things are under control, something else blows up literally." In the case of the eye dog, Zara chuckled softly, her eyes softening as she looked around the shop. "You're dealing with creatures from dozens of different worlds, each with their own quirks. You can't expect them to behave like Earth pets." Jack knew she was right, but it didn't make his job any easier. He'd gotten into the business thinking it would be exciting, fun even. He hadn't expected it to feel like babysitting hyperactive toddlers from across the galaxy. Zara wandered over to the quantum hamster, who was blinking in and out of existence inside its enclosure. "This one's new," she remarked, her fingers lightly tapping the glass. "You're branching out," Jack grunted. "Yeah. Got a new shipment this morning." "It's been interesting." The hamster blinked out of sight again, and Zara gave a small smile. "You know, Jack, maybe you're approaching this the wrong way." Jack raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Zara turned to face him fully, her green eyes sparkling with a hint of mischief. "You're trying to run this place like a normal pet store. But these aren't normal pets. You can't control them the way you would with animals from Earth. You've got to meet them on their level." Jack frowned. "And how exactly do I do that?" Zara's smile widened. "Watch." She approached the plasma ferret, a hyperactive ball of energy that had been phasing through walls and causing all sorts of trouble earlier. As Jack watched, Zara extended her hand toward the ferret. The little creature darted back and forth for a moment, its body glowing with a soft blue light, before suddenly calming. It approached Zara cautiously, sniffing her fingers before phasing through her hand and reappearing on her shoulder, perfectly calm. Jack blinked. "How did you do that?" Zara gave him a knowing look. "I didn't try to control it. I let it be what it is. Once it saw I wasn't going to try and force it to behave, it relaxed." Jack stared at her, dumbfounded. "You mean all this time, I've been trying too hard?" Zara nodded. "These animals are alien to you. They don't respond to control the way you're used to. You've got to embrace the chaos a little. Let them come to you on their own terms." Jack leaned back against the counter, processing her words. Maybe she had a point. Every day felt like a battle because he was trying to make the pets behave in ways that just weren't natural for them. If he changed his approach, maybe things would be less of a nightmare. Zara gently scratched the plasma ferret's head before placing it back in its enclosure. "You'll figure it out, Jack. You've just got to think outside the box." Jack let out a long breath. "Thanks, Zara. I guess I needed to hear that. She smiled again, turning toward the door. Anytime. I'll be back for a new pet soon. Try not to let the store implode before then. Jack laughed, watching as Zara left the shop. For the first time all day, he felt like he could breathe a little easier. He looked around at the chaos in the store, the overturned shelves, the eye dogs still lifeless on the floor, the Martian parrots squawking in the background, and decided it was time to change things up. If Zara could manage these crazy creatures without breaking a sweat, then so could he. Jack spent the next few hours cleaning up, rebooting the eye dog, and reorganizing the enclosures. Instead of getting frustrated when the Jupiter cats disappeared or the quantum hamster blinked out of existence, he let it go. He focused on creating a more relaxed environment, one where the pets and the customers could feel comfortable. By late afternoon, the store was starting to feel like a more manageable place. Jack even managed to sell a Martian parrot to an alien who had a surprisingly good sense of humor. As the day wore on, Jack found himself smiling more. The chaos hadn't disappeared, but it didn't seem as overwhelming. He was starting to see his shop in a new light. Sure, it was wild, unpredictable, and filled with some of the strangest creatures in the galaxy, but maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. As Jack was locking up for the night, he glanced over at the eye dog, who was sitting obediently by the door. "You know what, buddy? I think we might actually survive this." The eye dog's tail wagged in response, its reboot complete and functioning at least for now. The next morning, Jack woke up feeling more optimistic. He opened the shop early, making sure everything was in order before the first customers arrived. When the door jangled open, he greeted the alien family with a genuine smile instead of his usual forced cheerfulness. The day progressed with its usual ups and downs, but Jack found himself handling the chaos much better. The Jupiter cats still vanished at the worst possible moments, the Martian parrots told their terrible jokes, and the quantum hamster blinked in and out of existence. But Jack no longer saw these things as problems, just part of the charm of running an alien pet shop. By midday, the store was bustling with customers. A group of young aliens from a nearby planet were crowding around the plasma ferrets, fascinated by their ability to phase through walls. The eye dog was dutifully following Jack around, its glitches apparently fixed for the time being. As Jack rang up a sale for a Neptunian jellyfish, he realized that Zara had been right all along. The key wasn't to control the pets, it was to understand them, to let them be what they were and roll with the punches. The bell above the door jingled once again, and Jack looked up to see Zara standing in the doorway, her usual calm expression on her face. "Still in one piece, I see," she said, her eyes twinkling. Jack grinned. "Barely, but yeah." "You were right, Zara. I've been going about this all wrong." Zara stepped inside, glancing around at the bustling shop. "Looks like you're getting the hang of it." Jack nodded. "I think I am. It's still chaos, but maybe I like it that way." Zara smiled, giving him a small nod of approval. "Good. Because something tells me this place will never be boring." Jack laughed. "I think I can live with that." As Zara wandered off to browse the new arrivals, Jack leaned back against the counter, taking in the scene. His shop was chaotic, unpredictable, and filled with the strangest creatures in the galaxy, but it was his chaos. And for the first time, Jack realized that maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't have it any other way.